tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
What do people usually fear when moving out to live on their own? What sort of problems does one normally encounter when finally venturing from the safety of their parents' home into a place of their own? Perhaps it's paying their rent on time, or having to do all the cleaning without any of Mommy's help. These were the things I anticipated. I never could have predicted the events of the past week. We had finally moved the last box into my new house. Single-level ranch and only 2 bedrooms, but for a bachelor like me, it was a dream come true. The house was right in the heart of a great suburban neighborhood with a 2-car driveway and a pretty big backyard. When I had seen the yard, the first thing I thought of was all the parties I'd be hosting. I stepped onto the deck and took a breath of fresh air while closing my eyes to imagine the endless nights of friends, booze, and of course, women. I stretched my arms out and let out an exuberant sigh of relief. As I scanned my surroundings, I couldn't help but notice the elevated deck gave me the proper vantage point to see into my neighbors' backyards. I figured since I hadn't formally met any of them yet, I would try and guess now whom I'd have to worry about if my parties got too rowdy and the risk of 911 calls would become a harsh reality. To my right, I saw a vibrant garden, a grill, and a hammock. I figured it was a middle-aged couple. Hopefully they're not too old and cranky, I thought to myself as I turned my head to view my neighbors to the left. And that's when I saw him. Under a large oak tree, adorned in colorful Christmas lights, was what looked to be a young boy swinging away on his playset. Great, I thought. I bet his bedtime is a lot earlier than any party I throw would be ending. I continued to look at the boy. His back was turned to me. He wore a hoodie and gloves, which struck me as odd since it was summer and pretty warm outside. I brushed it off and assumed the boy was sick. I went back inside and began to unpack everything. With the help of some friends, we managed to put together all my furniture, hook up my home entertainment system, and more or less get the house in working order. I just sent out the text, guys. Get ready to party tonight, I exclaimed as I leaped off the couch and finished my beer. The guys all began to cheer, and a round of high fives were exchanged. By now, the sun was setting, as it had been several hours since we had first brought in all my belongings. My friend Dan was unpacking one of the last boxes as he eagerly looked out of the window.
Have you met your neighbors yet? Any fine young ladies gonna be coming around here asking to borrow some sugar?
He asked in a sarcastic tone as he turned to me with a lewd gesture. Smiling and walking over, I replied, "No, not yet, but I don't think I'll have much luck in that department. From the looks of it, it's just a bunch of normal families. One of them even has a kid." As I pointed to the house I had seen earlier, my face scrunched to show a look of confusion and surprise. The boy I had seen swinging earlier was still there. He was still swinging under the ambience of the lit-up tree. Weird. That kid was swinging when we first got here, too, I said to Dan as he looked at his phone. Barely acknowledging my comment, he raised his hand up and mumbled,
Must be a special ed kid or something.
He walked off, calling more people to invite them to the housewarming party. I turned back to the swinging boy. He couldn't have been swinging this whole time, could he? That night, as planned, we had my housewarming party. It was such a great time. I greeted my friends and cousins as they arrived, handing them all the beverage of their choice. We were outside until around 3 or 4 in the morning when the weather suddenly got cool and it began to drizzle. I would have been willing to stick it out until it passed, but the girls all began to freak out, claiming their hair would frizz, and they all ran inside. Naturally, the guys followed, holding makeshift umbrellas over the girls' heads. I laughed at myself at how hard they were trying to get lucky. I took the opportunity to quickly clean up some of the trash that had accumulated before going inside. I scooped up a bunch of cans and bottles before I turned around and was left in awe. I guess we were all distracted by the music and alcohol to notice earlier, but now, with everyone inside, I saw it. The boy was still outside and on his swing. He was still in the same position and outfit I'd seen him in all day, back turned to me, wearing the same hoodie and gloves. I stood there for a minute, lost in thought, when from behind me I heard a loud, "Hiya, neighbor." I jumped and did a quick 180, dropping the trash I'd been carrying. "Oh, sorry about that, bud. Didn't mean to startle ya," laughed an elderly man. He was wearing pajamas and slippers as he held his hand out, waiting for a shake on my end. "Oh, hello, sir," I said as I cleared my throat and shook his hand, collecting my thoughts. He smiled and began to fumble with his hands. "I hate to be that guy, especially since, you just moved in and everything, but you think you guys can turn down the music a bit? My wife and I are pretty light sleepers, and at this age, we tend to be early risers," he said bashfully. I smiled and laughed as I put my hand to my face in embarrassment. Geez, I'm sorry, sir. I guess things got a little crazier than planned. I didn't think people would stick around this long. I really did feel bad. I half expected the man to come out yelling, demanding us to keep it down lest he call the cops. His gentle demeanor was refreshing, and I was more than happy to oblige. I laughed and replied, I'll go let everyone know that they need to stay inside and take it down a notch. I'm Peter, by the way." I shook his hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Peter. I'm Paul," he said with a grin. As he smiled, his eyes drifted past mine and towards the swinging boy. "I assume you've noticed the Langer's kid by now, huh?" asked Paul as he cupped his hands and breathed into them to try to keep warm. "Yeah," I said as I turned to face him. "What's the deal with him? He's been on that thing all day." Paul shrugged. Not sure. No one really knows the story. He just swings and swings until eventually." Paul stopped and his eyes widened. "Wait, it's happening. Check it out." I turned around to find the boy had stopped swinging. He sat completely still for a moment before slowly rising from the rubber seat of the swing. He began to shake violently, falling to his knees and scraping the dirt below him. Even from where we were standing, we were able to hear his quick bursts of shrieking and gurgling. I became concerned. Was the boy okay? It looked like he was having an asthma attack or a seizure. I started to run to the boy in order to help, but stopped after a couple of steps. His mother had run out. I looked at her, completely sober now from the adrenaline that was pumping through my body. It was not a pleasant sight. She was a frail, haggard woman with a gray, knotted mane of hair on her head. Her skin was pale and her eyes had dark bags underneath. It looked as if she hadn't slept or had a proper meal for ages. Mrs. Langer rushed out quick, holding a small, orange bottle, the kind one would receive from a pharmacist. After she reached her boy, she knelt down and poured several white pills into her hand. Before she could even finish offering the pills to her son, he had grabbed her arm and buried his face into the palm of her hand, inhaling the pills. Mrs. Langer pulled away and began to rub her wrist. It appeared the boy had hurt her, which did not really surprise me due to how skinny the woman was. Paul and I watched intensely without uttering a single word. After a moment or two, the boy simply rose back to his feet, sat back down on his swing, and resumed his leisurely activity. Mrs. Langer grabbed the now empty orange bottle and proceeded back inside, still clutching her wrist. Paul and I were both shaken up, We had no idea what we had just seen. Wow, I've seen the boys spaz out before, but never that bad. I bet whatever condition he has is getting more severe. Poor kid, Paul said as he rubbed the back of his head. What? What exactly is wrong with him? I asked, with my eyes still glued to the child. Like I said, I don't know. No one around here does, Paul replied, turning around and walking back to his door. Anyway, my wife is probably getting worried. You have a good night, Peter. Yeah, I sighed, arranging my thoughts. Nice meeting you, Paul. We both exchanged a final wave and returned to our respective households. The party was dying down when I entered, and I was glad. What I had just seen took a lot out of me. The next morning, I felt like shit. The copious waves of alcohol I had carelessly consumed the night prior had finally caught up to me. My head throbbed, and I was severely parched. I stood up, and the arid sensation in my mouth and throat was quickly replaced by feelings of nausea. I scrambled to the bathroom and dropped to my knees, clutching the porcelain for dear life. Oh, at least I have the day off to recover, I thought to myself. I grabbed the sports drink I had strategically placed in the bathroom the day before in anticipation for my hangover and chugged it down in only a few gulps. I was no stranger to this feeling, and I knew what to expect. Within a couple of minutes, I began to vomit and immediately felt better, though not enough to have a very productive day. I mentally prepared myself for a day of movies, video games, and junk food. After a couple of hours of lying in my borderline vegetative state, I heard the mailman make his stop at my door. In no mood to get off the couch, I ignored it and continued binge-watching the zombie show everybody was raving about. It was probably not the best idea to be observing such grotesque gore while it felt as if a war was being waged in my stomach. I sucked it up and continued to watch. Several episodes later, I made my way to the kitchen and popped in a giant TV dinner into the microwave. While it cooked, I decided I would bring in the mail from earlier. I unlocked the front door and let in some much-needed fresh air. I stood at the door and scooped up the contents of my mailbox, sifting through the junk mail and the bills when I saw I'd received a package. Without scanning the box for more details, I brought the small box inside and cut off the tape. I opened it only to find a small orange bottle, like the one I'd seen my neighbor holding last night. I was puzzled and searched for the mailing label on the box. The mailman had delivered it to the wrong house. Annoyed, I let out a big sigh. I was not in the mood to get dressed and leave the house for anything, let alone awkwardly meet new neighbors in order to tell them I have the pills for their weirdo son. I looked out of my back window and saw the boy was swinging away as usual. I heard my microwave go off, indicating my food was ready. With one last glance at the child, I told myself the pills can wait, as the boy had scarfed down several the night before. I tossed the bottle of pills aside and made my way to the kitchen. After eating, I felt fatigued, which caused me to fall asleep on the couch. I woke up from my sleep to the sound of commotion outside my home. The repetitive beeping of a large vehicle in reverse echoed through my brain. Nightfall had arrived, and my house was engulfed in almost absolute darkness. The only light I could see was a dull gray from my now idle television, and the swirl of red and blue illuminating through my windows. The scene that I awoke to was almost surreal, and I thought for a moment that I was dreaming. I got on my feet and I looked through my front window. A crowd had gathered on my front lawn. They were facing the ambulance that was parked in the driveway of the Langer house. I threw on a light coat to hide my stained, most likely rancid-smelling shirt I had been stewing in all day. In the crowd, Paul stood amongst several other people who I presumed to be residents of the neighborhood. "Hey, Paul," I blurted as I cleared the phlegm from my throat. the hell is going on? With his eyes still glued to the scene that unfolded next door, he replied, "Well, we're not exactly sure. We think something may have happened to someone in the house. Mr. Langer is speaking with one of the paramedics, and he looks panicked." I saw the man Paul was referring to. Like his wife, Mr. Langer also looked as if his body was depleted and barren. He wore a loose tank top that showed just how skinny he was. His ribs poked through the pale, tight skin on his torso. He was pacing around frantically, covering his eyes and mumbling something to himself. I was still gazing at the distraught man when the soft murmuring of the crowd around me erupted into a frenzy of screams and cries. I turned to the door of the Langer house, and dread began to fill my body. 2 policemen exited the house, followed by a paramedic who wheeled out a gurney. Atop of the gurney was the bloodied body of the seemingly lifeless Mrs. Langer. From where we were standing, we were able to see the pale, bruised wrist of the poor woman hanging from the side, blood running down and dripping from her fingertips. It began to twitch and her head bobbed around as the paramedic pressed an oxygen mask to her face and hoisted the gurney into the back of the ambulance. I turned to Paul, who was standing on the tip of his feet in order to see over the crowd. One of the policemen made his way over to our now frantic group of screaming men and women, ordering us to disperse and return to our homes. Everyone began to bombard the officer with questions, asking what happened and if they were safe.
"You have nothing to worry about, people. It appears a group of coyotes attacked Mrs. Langer in her backyard. We've since located and neutralized the animals,"
remarked the officer, avoiding eye contact with anyone before him. It was clear he was lying through his teeth. I raised my hand and shouted above the crowd, "And what about the boy? Was he hurt?" The officer shot me a look of irritation and cleared his throat as he hesitantly announced,
"He was not anywhere near the scene of the attack. We assume he got scared and ran away for safety, and we're in the process of looking for the child. If anyone sees him, please call 911 immediately."
With that, the officer turned his back to the less than satisfied crowd and almost ran back to his cruiser. I turned to Paul, who bared a look of dismay. He turned and shot an apathetic smile before patting me on the back and making his way inside. I stood there for a moment after the crowd slowly disbanded. Was this my fault? Did it have something to do with the pills? I quickly disregarded the paranoid thoughts that plagued my mind and walked back to my home. I slid through the front door that I had carelessly left ajar and shut it behind me as I slid down and cupped my hands around my head. There was a legion of emotions coursing through me as I pondered my next move. I knew I had to get the pills out of my house. Though the chances were slim, I did not want any blame being directed at me for not returning the pills sooner. Hell, I knew I had committed at least one federal crime when I unknowingly opened somebody else's mail. I decided I would anonymously place the box of pills in the Langer's mailbox and dash back inside. I grabbed the pills from my couch and glanced out of the back window. The Christmas lights in the oak tree were as bright as ever, illuminating the grisly crime scene that lied just below. Blood and ripped clothing veiled the ground. That's when I saw them. The boy's gloves and hoodie were lying amongst the carnage. My heart sank. I was sure the boy was dead, or at the very least, critically injured. Tears began to fill my eyes as I banged my fists on the windowsill. The sudden burst of sound emanated throughout my home. I hadn't made a peep since I entered. The sudden contrast in sound made the shameful silence that followed even more noticeable. In the midst of the grim silence, I heard it. The low, spine-tingling gurgle that flowed from my bedroom. I froze. Barely breathing, I listened keenly for another sound. To my dismay, I heard it again. Another disgusting gurgle, now louder and fiercer, almost like a growl. The lights in my home were still all off, aside from the weak aura that radiated from the idle television. I was frozen still. My body rebelled against my mind's desire to move. Instinct began to kick in as my eyes adjusted to the darkness and fight or flight became a quick reality. I did not know what was in my house. All I knew was I was definitely going to choose flight. I pulled out my phone and fumbled for the flashlight app as I took a step towards my back door. My eyes were glued to the short hallway that connected the main area of the house to my bedroom. That's when I saw it. A small creature began to crawl from the hallway. I could barely make out any of its features. It looked human, but on all fours. The way it moved was eerie and awkward. The appendages moved sloppily and its head was to the ground. I heard the same terrifying gurgle from the creature and realized it was sniffing the floor. And what happened next still fills me with dread when I look back. The flashlight app I had opened had finished loading up and powered on through the phone. The bright light pierced the darkness and lit up the monstrous figure. I felt sick. Do you ever get the feeling in the middle of a nightmare where you start to suspect you aren't in reality and you're begging yourself to wake up? That desperate feeling of despair coursed through every fiber of my being. In front of me stood the Langer boy. Without all the layers of clothing he usually wore, I was able to see him for what he really was. This was not a normal child. His skin was tattered and worn out. Wrinkles and scars embellished his body. He slowly raised his head to the source of the light. Our eyes met. His eyes were the worst part. However intense the darkness around his mother's eyes were, they could not compete with the boy's. The black around his peepers only worked to showcase his dilated pupils and the unnatural color of the irises. I might as well have been made of stone. All my ability to move had completely ceased. I could only stand there and watch the situation unfold before me. The boy slowly turned his body in my direction and began to take steps closer and closer. He left bloody prints where his hands met with the wood grain of my floor. It was not long until he was less than a foot from me. For what seemed like an eternity, he did not move. Neither of us did. My mind was warped in panic, and I thought I would pass out. Before I had the chance, the boy rose from his animal-like posture. He was now standing on his feet, arms dangling to his sides. His eyes peered into mine. I stared back, still paralyzed with fear. He began to sluggishly turn his focus from my eyes to my hand, the one that still clutched a bottle of the pills. As soon as he realized what I held, he broke the silence and let out a demonic shriek like that of a banshee. Only his mouth moved as his jaw dropped. This awoke me from my trance and I fell down, still facing the boy. He crouched so that his face met mine. His mouth was still agape, exposing his sharp, mangled teeth. The tiny razor still contained small shreds of what I assumed to be his mother's flesh. He stretched his arm toward me and unraveled his blood-stained hand. Instantly, I knew what he was after. "You..." My voice trembled. You want your pills, right?" He continued to stare at me, unwavered by my question. I lifted up my hand and began to open the small orange bottle. With shaking hands, I poured several pills into the palm of the child. I waited for a minute. I did not know time could move so slowly. I just wanted him to leave. Eventually, the boy's mouth shut and curled into a faint smile. He turned and made his way to the back door. He shot one final glance over to me as he tilted his head back and consumed all the pills I had given him. With an audible gulp, he pushed open the door and wandered back to his sanctuary. I watched as the boy took a seat on his swing and began to sway forward and backward like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I managed to shut my back door before collapsing to the ground. It's been a week since that night, and I've returned the pills as planned. Mrs. Langer is still in critical condition, and now her husband has taken over, feeding the mysterious pills to his son whenever he needs them. I was never questioned by anyone about what transpired that night. I did not report the incident. I plan to move out soon. Maybe to an apartment in the city where there are no yards or playsets. The nightmares and fear from that night have run rampant in my mind. My backyard is still a mess from the party. I have not dared to go back there in order to clean things up. This is due to the fact that, since that fearful night, the boy makes sure to swing, facing my home. Whenever I even glance out of the window, I see his haunting eyes peering into mine as he smiles that horrid smile. The last I saw of the boy was his father coming out to give him another dose of the medication. Mr. Langer was down to his last bottle. That was 3 long nights ago. I'm looking out of the window now to see what I expected to see. An empty swing.
As a doctor, I'm bound by doctor-patient privilege to not disclose the specifics of what I'm about to tell you. But as a human being, I feel compelled to share. This is, without a doubt, the most horrific story I've ever had the displeasure of being a part of. It was 2009, and my schedule for that day was light. I was just finishing up my lunch when I got a call from a friend and colleague who had his own practice in the same building as me. Sometimes we would send work each other's way when we knew the other could use it. I was a bit elated at the prospect of him calling me because I'd just begun going over my books and stressing a bit.
Are you busy right now? I'd like to send someone up to you.
He said.
No, my afternoon is barren. What are the details?
It's a walk-in. From the look of it, an eating disorder. Her mother is concerned.
Eating disorder. Those can be unpleasant. I'd actually had a bulimic throw up in my office once when I stepped out momentarily to check my calendar. Still, I needed the work. All right. Send her up. I tried to tidy up my desk to make my office look more presentable and professional while I waited. 10 minutes ticked by and no patient showed up, so I stepped out to go looking for her. When I got to the hall, there was a small contingent of people standing around the elevator. They were talking amongst themselves. "What's going on?" I asked.
The elevator's broke.
Someone said. "Shit. I bet she's on there," I thought. "What floor is it stuck on?"
10th and 11th?
Yeah, that would be about right. My colleague's office was on the 10th, 3 floors down. I knew from experience that it could be anywhere up to an hour before they got the elevator working again. I hoped she wasn't claustrophobic. Returning to my office, I called downstairs.
What's up?
My colleague asked after picking up. "She's stuck in the elevator." He laughed.
Really? Poor thing.
"What's her name?"
Amelia.
He paused.
Amelia D. something.
"All right, thanks. If you got any impressions on her from your brief visit, maybe you can share them later. Over drinks?"
Sure,
Don't tell me. I want to form my own opinion first.
Okay.
True to form, an hour and 10 minutes later, I heard a loud cheer from the hallway, indicating the elevator had started working again. I should go make sure she's all right, I thought to myself, and went out to join the throng of people standing around in the hallway. There were a lot more people by then, and I couldn't make my way to the elevator doors or even see them from where I was, but I could hear it when the elevator dinged, indicating it was stopping on our floor, and the rolling mechanical sound of the doors opening. There was a loud gasp from the crowd of people, followed by a lot of jabbering.
Holy shit!
Someone said quite loudly. People started hustling away from the elevator, shoving past me. I struggled against the tide and made my way to where a number of people were standing around, staring into the elevator cab. As I approached, I could smell this stench. It was like stumbling into the apartment of a recluse who hadn't come out or bathed for years. It rolled like a wave out of the elevator and cascaded over everyone in the hallway. A young man in a business suit who looked dressed for an interview was covering his mouth and nose with a handkerchief. I skirted around him to see into the elevator. The woman in the elevator was not at all what I was expecting. Massively obese, she looked like she weighed somewhere around 500-600 pounds. Her face was so puffed up, her eyes were barely visible, just 2 dark dots above her cheeks. She had frizzed out brown hair that still had curlers in it. The notion that I was smelling a recluse seemed all the more plausible at the sight of her. Her mouth was covered with what looked like greasy barbecue sauce. There was even some sort of gristle at the corners of her lips. There was more of it all over her hands and wiped down the front of her shirt. It looked like she had come straight from an all-you-can-eat rib buffet. Clenched tightly in one of her hands was a big black trash bag that sagged full of something that seemed to slosh around inside it. The smell coming out of it was nauseating. The woman stepped out of the elevator, her eyes and nose running with tears and mucus. I stepped forward while everyone else backed away, horrified. "Amelia?" I asked her. She looked at me through her beady little piggy eyes, her cheeks covered with that vile red gunk and streaking with tears, and opened her mouth. For about 3 seconds, I had the horrible notion that she was going to vomit an entire barbecue on me.
I was hungry.
She stuttered with a thick southern accent. The young man in the suit heaved involuntarily at the smell of her breath, and then strode away trying to maintain his demeanor. That's okay. Do you want to talk about it in my office? I said, reaching out to help her. Seeing me reach out to her, she clenched her black trash bag tightly and hugged it to her chest. The contents of it made a sickening squish sound. I could taste my own lunch in the back of my throat. Is that yours? I asked. I'm not going to take it. She started sobbing, this horrible, almost hob-like squeal of a sob. Honestly, I didn't want to touch her. I wanted to go back into my office, lock the door, and pretend I was glad my afternoon was completely empty. The smell wafting off her and off that bag of spoils was going to be permeating every crevice of my office for days. I just knew it. Still, this was a human being that had come seeking my help, and I was not about to turn her away. My office is right down the hall. Why don't you come with me? I started walking. In my head, I said, if she doesn't come with me, fuck it. She can go back to her apartment that's probably filled with roaches and feces and who knows what other ungodly things, and I'll find someone else to help. But she followed me, lumbering on legs that stretched the limits of the sweatpants she had on. I held the door open for her and she waddled in, kneading the contents of that trash bag in her thick sausage fingers, making it belch and splurge. She stopped and just stood there in the middle of my office.
The elevator got stuck,
she mumbled. Yes, I'm sorry about that. I hope you were all right. Thank goodness you brought something to eat, yes? She started crying again, squeezing her trash bag, and I was afraid it was going to explode and leave God knows what all over my office floor. She nodded as her face turned red and tears poured out of seemingly every pore of her head. I went and got her a box of tissues and handed her a couple. She tried to take them while still holding onto the bag with both hands. Would you like me to hold that? I offered, praying she'd say no. She shook her head. What do you have in there? I finally decided to ask. She huffed and snorted, trying to inhale all the fluid back into her face. Using one of the tissues, she mopped her eyes and mouth, getting blotchy red smears all over the place.
Leftovers?
She stuttered. Then her chest started heaving, and she threw her head back and started bawling again. Her face was like a fountain. She was so utterly miserable, and I really started to feel bad for her. Look, I said, getting stuck in that elevator was obviously pretty traumatic. Her wailing hit a crescendo. So why don't we postpone things until you've calmed down a bit? She struggled through her sobbing.
You want to meet with me?
Well, yes, but not today. Why don't you go home and try to relax? I don't think you're in the right frame of mind right now to talk. So let's schedule an appointment for later this week. How does that sound? I walked back to my desk and got out one of my cards. Her mouth was quivering and she looked ready to collapse into a pile of screaming phlegm, but she was calming down a bit, just nodding more than anything. And she took my card with the same sticky fingers, holding several drippy tissues.
Thank you,
she said quietly. I couldn't read her face at all. Her features were so red and swollen and wet that she seemed almost blank and expressionless. Do you want me to escort you down to the lobby? I asked, in case something happens with the elevator again. It should be all right, but I don't want you to be nervous. She shook her head.
That doesn't seem like a good idea.
Okay. And with that, she turned around and waddled out of my office, slowly, sobbing slightly every now and then. With her went that sloshy black trash bag, and with them both went that putrid aroma of filth and squalor. I literally breathed a sigh of relief as I heard the door click shut. She never called me back. It was a week later that I finally got around to having drinks with my colleague from downstairs. We were relaxing, having a couple beers, and I suddenly remembered her. "Oh, thanks, by the way," I said.
For what?
"For Amelia."
Who?
"Amelia. Eating disorder. Last week you sent her up to me, remember?"
Oh, right.
He sipped his beer.
The one who got stuck in the elevator. How did that go?
"She was a wreck," I said, sobbing and practically hysterical. "I talked her into rescheduling, but she hasn't called me to make an appointment."
Did you talk to her mother?
"No, I didn't get any information from her. I gave her my card."
What did you think?
He asked. "Classic food dependency," I said. "Definitely a binge eater." Her face was just all...
No, not the mother, I mean Amelia.
"What?"
What did you think of Amelia?
He said again. "I'm telling you what I thought."
Amelia, the scrawny 12-year-old girl, you think is a binge eater?
"What? No, that's not..." And then it hit me. Was her mother with her?
Yeah, I sent them both up to you.
They were in the elevator together? He looked at me, and the same dawning realization came over his face. Needless to say, she never rescheduled. Amelia D. something. Nor did her mother, the nameless, obese woman I met that day at the elevator, smelling like death, covered in gore, and carrying her trash bag of sloshing leftovers. What began as a wretched weekend for Preston Alstott was turning out most glorious. His elation would have invariably been lost on the casual observer who did not share his passion for botany. But knee-deep in the brackish muck of the Everglades, leeches, gators, and fist-sized mosquitoes aside, he was reborn. Preston had woke on the last day of class, planning to work through spring break. His Friday morning took a turn for the worse when he discovered a pipe in his kitchen had burst. His car would not start, and then he learned Harvard no longer required the talents of two fellow biologists in the upcoming year. With untold semesters to go before he could even hope for the security of tenure, Preston thought his position was threatened. He needed to publish, or at least contribute to some credible research, to bolster his resume if he were to have any chance of staying with the university. But he had no idea where to begin. It was all too much. Preston had to get away. He called his contractor, worked out where to leave the key, and taxied to the airport. 5 hours later, he was on a red-eye to Florida. Preston considered calling his research team, but the trip was supposed to be a casual getaway, not an expedition. Janie, he thought. She should have been part of his team, but she'd refused to accompany him on the last leg of his doctoral pursuit, choosing to stay in Ithaca. By sophomore year, Janie told him that she would always be his second most loved carbon-based life form. They still talked once per month by phone, but hadn't been face-to-face or body-to-body in over 6 years. Ever since, Preston was married to his work, and he made no apologies. Human relationships had always been too difficult. Plants were easy. They lived and died. In the interim, they waged a silent war for survival, doing their damnedest to choke out competitive species for territorial dominance. Emotions were never involved. There was no need for conversation or compromise. Plants were content to be alone. 6 years hadn't helped him forget. Preston was still thinking of Janie as his plane taxied the tarmac. Preston took full advantage of the hotel's continental breakfast, then showered and slathered on sunscreen. After grabbing a folder full of ungraded midterms and the complimentary Miami Herald, he headed to the beach. It was spring break, and the college tourists that had bombarded the city still had a few more hours before they would depart, zombie-like, for their hotels, leaving the oceanfront suspiciously devoid of sunbathers. An hour later, Preston had only trudged through 3 midterms. It was difficult to focus. Peeling himself from his chair, he waded into the blue-green Atlantic. Diving under the waves, Preston made his way past the breakers. He followed the tide to buoy him as he lay backward. Eyes closed, he floated, mentally riffling through rare orchid species. It was a form of yoga he'd first utilized years ago. Cymbidium sinense, indigenous to India, Taiwan, and Thailand, found in cool climates and requires ample light with lower temperatures. Thrives in an ideal humidity between 40 and 60%. Cattleya schillerania, Brazil. Grows in cool to hot temperatures on cliff faces and in rivers anywhere from sea level to 800 meters above. Often used to create hybrids in attempts to breed super orchids. Dendrophylax lindeni. First found in Cuba in 1844. Discovered in South Florida 50 years later. Commonly known as the ghost orchid, due to its billowy white appearance. 2,000 known to exist in the state. Their location mostly kept secret by researchers and horticulturalists. Considered the most sought-after orchid in the world. Preston opened his eyes at the realization, losing the poise of his float posture. South Florida? He was in South Florida. Within 40 minutes, he could be in the heart of Big Cypress Swamp. He couldn't believe he hadn't thought of it sooner. He could find a ghost orchid. Bringing one back would be tantamount to sacrilege, but if he got the chance to study one in the wild, to even see one, it would spark inspiration for his next project and save his position at Harvard. Preston dug his cell phone from his bag. Dialing information, he asked for airboat companies. He stopped the operator at the third listing. The operator connected him directly.
Fandango Airboat Tours. Best gator-gazing gateway in the Glades.
The gravelly voice on the other end extolled.
Mo speaking. May I help you?
Do you have tours going out today?
Sure do.
Mo replied. Preston waited expectantly. What time? He asked, realizing Mo wasn't volunteering additional information.
Time you want to leave?
Mo asked, after an audible sip and swallow. How about around noon? Preston suggested, caught it off guard at the man's nonchalance. He wondered if all the natives were as casual.
Nah, noon's no good. Too damn hot. How about, let's say, 4? Sun'll be lower.
Mo countered. 4 it is.
Preston agreed. Listen, is there any chance this could be a private tour?
Hell, they'll all be private today. Spring breakers don't care about airboating. Ain't no sex or booze in it.
He paused.
Well, no sex anyway. Unless a couple of them co-eds show up and play their cards right.
Preston arrived at Fandango 15 minutes early. There wasn't much to the place. The tiny shack had an attached pavilion that barely covered 2 picnic tables. An old cash register sat atop a weathered bar. 2 t-shirts, one red, one black, hung on coat hangers dangling from the rafters. The sun-bleached shirts proudly displayed the white Fandango logo, an airboat driven by an oversized, bespeckled alligator, sunglasses resting on his snout. A graying, rotund man wearing a trucker's cap with the same logo emerged from the shack. His name was embroidered on his black polo. Mo.
Howdy, friend. You must be my 4 o'clock. Mr.
Doctor, actually, Preston corrected. Dr. Preston Alstott.
My apologies,
Mo said, extending his hand.
MD?
Professor of Botanical Sciences at Harvard, Preston said, shaking the large man's hand.
An Ivy League plant man. Funny.
I suppose so, Preston agreed, surprised he'd never made the same connection.
You must be here on business, considering your request for a private ride,
Mo surmised. Correct. I'm hoping to find...
A ghost orchid?
Mo finished for him. It was quickly becoming apparent that despite the man's yokel appearance, he was no dummy.
I can probably help you with that, but it'll cost a little more. About we say 100.
That won't be a problem, Preston assured him, pulling his wallet from his back pocket.
Card readers on the fritz,
Mo said when he saw Preston thumbing a visa. Oh, sure. Preston fished out the cash.
Alrighty then,
Mo said, pocketing the bills as he headed back inside the shack. He reemerged with a hefty red and white cooler in his right hand. In his left, he carried a bag of jumbo marshmallows.
Okay, Professor. Let's ride.
15 minutes later, they were speeding through the swamp. The boat tore through a swarm of mayflies. The insects peppered Preston's face like scattered buckshot. He'd never been so thankful for sunglasses.
Sorry about that, Doc.
Mo yelled over the sound of the whining propeller.
Trying to avoid some brush on the left.
Stilted red mangroves threw roots in intricate patterns across the swamp floor. Preston was impressed at how well Mo was dodging the trees.
We only need a couple inches of water, but we can still snag anything too stout or dry,
Mo called out. The combined speed, gas fumes, and frequent zigzagging weighed on Preston. How much further? He yelled.
Half hour, maybe a little more. Your thumb ain't the only thing green right now, Doc. Here, I'll pull over for a sec. Let you get your gut right.
Mo killed the throttle. Turning the propeller handle, he guided the boat into a culvert. The fan blades whirred to a stop as the boat drifted slowly. Thanks, Preston said, his stomach appreciative. Examining the perimeter, he spied bladderworts, water lilies, and spatterdocks. Preston saw a trickling ripple swirl to the left of the boat. What was that? He asked anxiously.
That,
Mo said, leaning over the side of the boat,
is Big Al. He's a local legend in these parts.
Al? As in...
You came by that doctor in honest, by God,
Mo said, opening the bag of marshmallows.
Yeah, old Al is about 18 feet worth of gator. Most folks figure he's about 60 years old.
Most gators grow to about 11 and check out. He's what a fella like you would probably call an anomaly.
Preston craned his neck. He watched Mo, trying to follow the older man's searching eyes. Something so large should have been easier to find. Staring off the rear of the boat, Mo plucked a marshmallow from the bag and held it over the water.
You may want to scoot back, Professor, Mo said.
Preston inched back as far as his seat allowed. He tensed, feeling sweat drip down his back. The sun may have weakened, but the humidity was as thick as ever. He'd forgotten it while the boat was cutting through the swamp, the headwind drying his skin. Mo clicked his tongue as casually as if he were summoning a house cat.
Here, gator, gator, gator.
With a violent splash, Big Al broke the water, lunging upward for Mo's outstretched arm. The gator's moss-green head was easily the size of a curbside garbage can, its yellow teeth, thick as fingers, gnarled like splayed barbed wire. Big Al unhinged his bottom jaw so wide that it looked as if he could swallow Mo whole. At the last possible second, the old boatman dodged backward, letting the marshmallow fly. The gator snatched it from the air and fell back into the water, sending a swell under the boat that nearly capsized it. Preston pitched backward in a vinyl seat, clutching it tightly. Mo cackled.
You all right, Doc? Man, you should have seen your face.
Preston couldn't speak. He really wanted to, so he could ask Mo just what the hell was wrong with him and why he would endanger both their lives for such a stupid stunt. But his lips wouldn't work. Mo offered the bag to Preston.
Your turn. Give it a shot?
No, thank you, Preston stammered. His eyes were wide as he frantically scanned the water.
Suit yourself, Mo said. You don't know what you're missing.
Is he coming back?
Not unless I offer him another.
Please, don't, Preston begged. Mo chuckled.
I'm sorry, Doc. It's just a gag I use with the tourists. They get a kick out of it. Of course, you don't usually do it with Al. He can be a little intimidating.
Genghis Khan was a little intimidating. Big Al would have made him soil his fur-lined panties, Preston said dryly. Mo grinned, reached into the cooler and popped the top off a beer, shoving it at Preston.
Have one. It'll calm your nerves.
Staying low, Preston took as few steps as possible to accept the offer. Thanks, he said.
Don't worry. She ain't gonna tip over,
Mo assured him.
Tell you what, I'll get us back out onto the main, and we can troll a bit before we pick up speed again.
Great. Mo fiddled with buttons on what Preston recognized as the engine. Pulling a ripcord, the fan blade spun to life. He reached for the rudder, gently guiding the boat into the open swamp. Preston sipped his beer. It was bitter. He studied the label. Swamp Ape IPA.
Yeah, it's brewed up in Melbourne,
Mo said. It's good, Preston lied.
Bet your ass it is. Just like everything in Florida. Except the damn Cubans.
Preston shot him an uncomfortable glance.
No offense,
Mo quickly added. None taken. Preston pulled his cell phone from his pocket. 11 minutes after 5. How long until the orchids? He asked.
Depends how you're feeling,
Mo replied. I'm good. We can pick up speed anytime.
Relax, Doc. Enjoy the scenery. You ain't paying by the hour, and you're still looking a little green.
Preston swatted a mosquito from his neck, wishing he'd stop for repellent.
The Spanish were the first to ever map the Glades, though they hadn't even seen it,
Mo began in full tour guide mode, speaking just loud enough that Preston could hear him over the sound of the engine.
They knew there was something between the Gulf and the Atlantic. but they didn't know exactly what. They named it Laguna del Espirito Santo, Lake of the Holy Spirit.
Right. I read that in the brochure, Preston said.
The primary vegetation here is obviously sawgrass, which has some interesting characteristics. For example, sawgrass leaves will burn.
But not the submerged roots, Preston said. It's how the sawgrass survives all the fires caused by lightning strikes.
Sharp cookie,
Mo said. Preston smiled. That is kind of my area of expertise, he said with an air of pride.
How about a little history lesson then?
Please, Preston said, less anxious.
I'm sure you're familiar with the lost colony of Virginia.
Sure. They were the last members of modern-day North Carolina's Roanoke colony who disappeared. When other settlers came looking for them, they found all their homes and buildings dismantled. The only clue to their disappearance was the word Croatoan, carved into a nearby tree, Preston said, as if he were lecturing back at Harvard.
What happened?
Mo asked. Well, there are two theories. Some scholars believe the group was signaling that they were relocating to Croatoan Island, what we now know as Hatteras Island.
And the other theory?
The colonists were trying to point to a tribe that abducted them. That's highly unlikely, though, Preston said, leaning into the boat as it cut to the right.
You think so?
How would someone have the wits or the time to carve something like that into a tree during a mass kidnapping?
Oh, you'd be surprised what fear can do,
Mo said, finishing his beer.
What if I told you we had our own little lost colony right here in the Glades?
I didn't realize there were colonists here.
Not colonists, per se. Indians. I mean, Native Americans.
Go on, Preston said, setting his empty swamp ape bottle in the bottom of the boat. Mo tossed him another. Mo cleared his throat.
Initially, there were two major tribes in the Glades, the Calusa and the Tequesta. The Calusa were the big boys. Several thousand of them lived here, but they suffered attacks from an invading Yamasee tribe from the north. Less than 1,000 survived. Most fled with the Spanish explorers who relocated them to Cuba. But when disease started killing them off, they moved to the Keys. The Tequesta were supposedly a peaceful bunch, but the Spanish were scared shitless. Said the Tequesta ambushed their sailors who ran aground in the Glades and would torture them to death. Half a decade later, Spanish priests tried to build missions along the coast, figuring they might be able to convert them. Turns out another invading tribe, the Yuchi, took care of that problem instead. Between them and the Seminoles, the Tequesta were nearly wiped out. Around 1770, a British historian found most of their villages leveled. Legend has it that the final 30 surviving Tequesta were deported to Havana. Most folks around here don't believe that, though.
So what do they think happened? Preston asked, between swallows.
Well, nobody really knows, but this flower you're looking for? The old-timers around here swear those dead Indian spirits are what gives those things life.
So you're saying the Tequesta put the ghost in the ghost orchid? Preston said, feebly suppressing a grin.
I'm just telling you what folks believe. That's why they say those orchids are so rare, so special. They think the Tequesta's spirits inhabit the orchids and protect them. Sort of the last piece of their property they don't want to lose.
Mo explained. Well, I've heard some interesting theories on plant development, but that's a new one to me. Mo revved the throttle gently and motioned for Preston to steady himself.
All I know is that you don't get to be old by being stupid.
As the time passed, the beer proved to be a double-edged sword. It undoubtedly helped make the trip more enjoyable, but it seemed to have stolen Mo's recollection of the orchid's location. Preston cut himself off at 3. He wanted to be lucid when, if, they found the orchids. He'd lost count of how many Mo had finished, or how many times he'd followed dead ends. Still, his control of the airboat seemed unfazed. Preston took out his cell phone to check the time, but the battery was dead. The last thing he'd seen on it was a notification of a voicemail from his contractor. He'd simply replied, "Fix it," in text. He estimated that it was close to 8 o'clock. The sun had set about a half hour earlier and twilight streaked the sky. "How much longer?"
I'm pretty sure they're just up around that bend there.
Preston followed Mo's gesture, spying the outline of a tiny outcropping.
Yep, won't be long now.
Preston restrained his anticipation. Though Mo had been good company, his navigational track record had proven less than stellar. The time hadn't been a total waste. Talking about the Everglades' history was the lengthiest conversation he'd had with anyone, not even talks with Janie. And there she was again, right where he'd left her, waiting in the back of his mind. Mo idled the boat into the cove.
We're here.
He gestured toward the sawgrass before them.
May I present the Florida Ghost Orchid?
Hundreds of ghost orchids, as white as they were in every picture Preston had seen, danced in the gently lapping water. He was moved to tears.
You okay, Professor?
My God, there's so many. There were only supposed to be 2,000 in the state, Preston said, his attention unwavering.
Well, that may have been all they've found, but that don't mean that's all there is. When you've been running the glades as long as I have, you learn a few secrets.
Mo eased the boat closer, allowing Preston a better look.
There's enough ground there to walk right out and touch one.
He pointed to the 20 feet of mud-covered bank in front of the boat. Seriously? Aren't there gators out there? Preston asked, captivated by the opportunity.
Hell, Doc, there's gators everywhere around here. Just don't stay too long. I'll keep the light on and holler if I see anything.
Preston tossed his wallet and phone in the boat, then eased his way out onto the marshy beach. He swapped his vision between the orchids and the watery slop that came up to his knees, in case Big Al or one of his cousins chose to make an appearance. But there, that close, he was more excited than afraid. He reached out and cradled an orchid. Its petals, sepals, and lobes all fluttered in perfect unison. Its fluted stigma stood proud, displaying elegance amongst strength. My God, Preston repeated, laughing joyously. Mo, you've got to come see this up close. This is unbelievable.
No thanks,
Mo said.
I'll pass.
Preston heard the boat's motor start back up, but he couldn't take his eyes off the orchids.
All right, Doc. It's been real. Second thought, stay a while. I think you'll like it here.
Mo called out as he opened the engine full bore. Preston turned. The shrill hum and sudden gust of the fan disrupted his stupor. He lunged after the reversing boat, taking 2 steps, and then plummeted face first into the waist-high water. Panic and confusion overtook him. He tried to swim after Mo, but was tossed aside by the boat's churning wake. Preston screamed, begging Mo to return until he lost sight of the spotlight. Terrified and alone in the blackness, he slid back through the ooze to the company of the orchids. Scratching blindly in the muck, Preston scrambled as high on the bank as possible to escape the reach of any gators. He found the root of a mangrove and held on for dear life, trying to get his feet on land. A guttural murmur came from the left. froze and listened. A moment later, it warbled again, louder. An echo answered from behind him, followed by another. Within seconds, terrifying sounds surrounded him. Preston tried to run, but tumbled back into the marsh. He stayed under for as long as he could, hoping the noise would be gone when he surfaced. For a moment, the noises sounded like a language, an ancient, lost language unfamiliar to Preston. He rose from the water, working towards the shore, then stopped dead in his tracks. The glow of tiny red dots danced in the darkness. They bounced within yards of him before disappearing. Suddenly, the small pair of lights came back, joined by other pairs. Eyes, Preston thought. He stood, water seeping into his very core. Dozens of different colored eyes stared at him, glowing yellow, orange, and red. Something brushed past his legs, snapping him back into reality. He thrashed in the water, trying to find the mangrove to back against. Silence and stillness returned. All the eyes disappeared. Preston clambered up onto the roots of the tree. He had imagined it all. It must have been some type of a fish against his leg and fireflies in the trees. Most stories had gotten the better of him, but it wouldn't get the best. He was a man of science, after all. Suddenly, dozens of moss-covered hands reached up, took hold, and pulled Preston beneath the liquid black. He thrashed, kicking and screaming, his bubbling voice sounding much like those of his now screaming tormentors. Reds, oranges, and yellows flashed around him as he was pulled into the bowels of the swamp, mud and water filling his nose, eyes, and lungs. Preston ceased struggling as the strong hands gently guided him deeper into the mud. When he opened his eyes, he could see clearly. Everything was in shades of yellow. Vines snaked around him, piercing his flesh in excruciating precision. Slimy vegetation slithered down his throat, nesting his organs in floral incubators. Roots slowly replaced his bones. Preston heard the process in his mind, the sentient screams of his dying cells and the triumphant battle cries of the new organisms conquering his body. Then came the voices of his brothers, warm and inviting, as they began to hoist him from the murk. He finally understood them all. Still, he tried holding on. He tried salvaging what was left of himself, of Preston. Why resist? He wondered. All his fears were fading. This was everything he had ever wanted. Preston wasn't alone anymore. But then he thought of Jenny, Jamie, Janet, Jan. What was it again?
The lights of the Seattle skyline suddenly ignite as the city comes alive with the sounds and sights of night. In a run-down bar, a lone man sits beneath the hum of a fluorescent overhead light as he holds his whiskey in shaky hands. The man is an enigma. He appears at the Spade habitually at 10 p.m. and leaves just before dawn, ordering the same refreshment each time, a tall glass of Irish whiskey. Never speaking words far from the usual, or the occasional grunt or whisper, he is a shadow to everyone. To the passerby, this man is just a nobody. He is merely a bum who went down on his luck and turned to the bottle like many before him. To those who know, however, the man's name is Robert Elm. and he has a story to tell. The night was fraught with frigid rain and sleet. The typically lively Spade was deserted, except for Robert. He sat in his usual spot, back left table facing the wall, hunched over with his beverage in total silence, save for the hum of the light and the drumming of the bartender's fingers on the metal cash register. Over the years that Elm had drifted in, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bartender had grown curious of his motives, though he told his customers the same old lost his job, wants to unwind excuse. In his heart he knew there was something off-kilter about the whiskey-loving shadow. Tonight would be different. The bartender bit his lip, took a deep breath, and approached his loyal customer. The barkeep placed his hand on the table and inquired in the friendliest of tones, "How you doing?" Robert jolted upright as if he had heard a gunshot. He slowly lifted his head and peered deep into the bartender's face with his wide gray eyes. He possessed an unsettling and powerful stare that pierced the air in a way the bartender had never seen before. His mouth slowly slid open as he grumbled, "Fine. And you?" The bartender was stunned. He'd expected the old geezer's usual response of a few quiet mumbles, but was greeted by a question that was startlingly normal. I'm just fine," the bartender said. "So, mister, I've been meaning to ask you." Elm's slowly graying eyebrows perked with anticipation. "Why do you come here all the time?" The drunkard chuckled and asked in return, "Why do you care what an old man like me does with his time?" "Because," the bartender said with a look of confusion, "you have come to my bar at the same time of night, every night for the past 12 years, and I am now just hearing you speak. I think that's reason enough for me to ask." The old man burst into laughter that lasted nearly a full minute. Finally, his outburst died off, and he asked, "You wanted to know why I wasn't talking?" "Yes," yelled the bartender. "It's been a riddle I've been trying to figure out about you for years." Robert set his drink on the table and said, Well, new friend, honestly, I was waiting for you to ask me that question, and now that we have that elephant out of the room, have a seat across from me." The bartender obliged, took a seat across from his new acquaintance, and with a look of sheer amazement on his face, he asked, "So, let me get this straight. You never said a word to anyone in this bar for 12 years because you were waiting for someone to come to you?" "Yep," the shade replied as the bartender gave a short laugh and continued, "Well, sir, what have you been waiting for so long to tell someone?" Robert Elm looked at the bartender square in the eye and said, "My story, of course." The bartender gave a quizzical expression as the drinker went on, never breaking his gaze. "The story of why I ended up here. The story of how I nearly escaped death itself, and since I don't see anyone else here, you, sir, are going to be the first one in a long time to hear my tale. You're in for a treat." The old man cracked a crooked smile. "Well, let's hear it then," the bartender said, and Robert chuckled again. "That's the spirit, kid. Grab a drink and get comfortable, 'cause you're in for quite a tale." And so Robert Elm began his story. It all began back in November of 1962. I was living in a small rural town in Iowa. Back then, everybody knew everyone else, like family. It was a safe place. That's why my family settled down back there when the area was a barren patch of farmland. Through the entirety of my teenage years, I was chasing a girl named Elizabeth. I can practically see her now. As time went by, our relationship grew. After high school, we bought up her uncle's house on 4th Street and slowly learned to live together as a soon-to-be married pair. This was a struggle, to say the least. Back when I was a younger man, I had a fiery temper that seemed to grow as we became closer to one another. I remember one specific instance when I heard she had wrecked my dad's Ford. I hit her across the face with a trash can lid. I had never regretted anything more in my life. It wasn't even her fault. Every morning, for the next month, I would come downstairs to see the pale red bruise on her face and immediately get too choked up to speak. It was a wonder she kept me around. One night, everything fell apart. I can't even remember why, but she left me on the side of the road and told me, "Find your own way home, you sack of crap." I remember my heart sinking as she pulled away and I began to wander the side of the empty country road. I'm unsure how I got so sidetracked, but after about an hour of hysterical rambling, I had ended up halfway into one of the cornfields bordering the only road in and out of town. There I was, sobbing profusely, lashing out at the cornstalks with my fists and wailing, "Elizabeth!" and "I'm sorry!" at the top of my lungs, with only the birds and the occasional scarecrow bearing witness. I hobbled aimlessly for what felt like hours, screaming and crying over what I had put my beloved fiancée through until I decided to sit down in a barren patch about 15 feet across to catch my breath and form an apology for my eventual homecoming. After inspecting the area for any signs of danger, I laid my head down in the soft dirt to rest my eyes. Several hours of blissful, tear-free sleep passed before I pulled awake by the rustling in the stalks. My heart skipped a beat and a chill ran down my spine. I bolted upright. Before me, a massive shape garbed in a shimmering black cloak slid out from the rows of crops. It moved towards me slowly, as if it were floating across the ground, though its feet were clearly visible, and it appeared to be human. It had pale, wrinkled hands that hung at its sides as it drifted closer. It drooped its hooded head and spoke squarely into my face in a dry monotone. "Good evening, traveler." Stunned, I got up from the dirt and asked, "Who are you?" He answered, "Just a man on his way to a meeting." I looked at him, bewildered. "Why are you here?" I asked. He looked up and said, "I enjoy taking the scenic routes, so much more peaceful than the hustle and bustle of the roadsides. Now, what I'm wondering is, who are you and why are you here?" As I look back, I'm surprised at how eager I was to reveal so much of myself to a total stranger. "My name is Robert," I said sheepishly. "My girlfriend dumped me out here because we got into a fight and I hit her and she cried and the tears were welling up in my eyes again." "Say no more, friend," the man interrupted as he waved his hand. "I offer you a proposition. You may come with me, attend my meeting, my friends, and I shall cheer you up, and we will take you back to your home in the morning. How does that sound?" A smile slowly formed on my face as I thanked the hooded figure. I reached out to shake his hand for his patronage, but he quickly recoiled, claiming there was no need to thank him. Together, we made our way through the remainder of the field and into the forest that formed an insulated border between patches of farmland. As we walked, I had more time to examine my new friend's figure. He was a titan of a man, to say the least, with hands that could easily cover my own twice over. Blending into the trees themselves, he towered over me at what I would assume to be well over 7 feet. He moved with surprising agility for someone of his size, darting through the branches and over roots at a speed a tad slower than a jog. I had to walk nearly twice as fast to keep up. His robes still shimmered as they did in the cornfield, though the moon was no longer visible. Oddly, no matter how fast the man moved, his hood never failed to conceal his face. Growing bored of silence, I struck up conversation. "So, what's your name?" I asked. The man glanced down and told me, "You may call me Lombard. It's one of my many monikers." "Okay, Lombard, who are these friends of yours, and what is this meeting, and where are we going?" "Just a meeting, friend. Held here in the woods with some close acquaintances of mine. No need to worry about it, Robert. Think of it as more of a party. It will take your mind off your troubles." It was at this moment I realized what I was doing, the exact opposite of what society had taught me. I was found lying in a field, and decided to walk off with some strange hooded man to go and meet his friends in the woods. Heartbreak can drive people to do some crazy things. It wasn't long before we saw a light in the distance. As we grew nearer, the lights turned out to be a ring of torches lining a circular clearing, containing rows of chairs and tables. An altar, draped with red cloth, sat in the middle of it all. At each of the tables sat groups of people dressed similarly to Lombard. Some of them had their faces exposed and the hoods down. "We have arrived," said Lombard with glee. "Sit down amongst the others and help yourself to some food and drink. The festivities will begin soon." I made my way to one of the less talkative groups and grabbed a free seat. As I recall, it was the only seat that wasn't taken. Next to me sat an old couple and a younger man with his hood up. When I asked each of them why they were here, I got a less than ideal response. The couple started cackling as if they had just heard the greatest joke of their lives, and the hooded man just grunted something I couldn't make out. Seeing no entertainment in the people around me, I decided to try the food. There were the occasional bits of bread surrounded by meats of all shapes and sizes. Having eaten a filling meal in town a few hours before this all began, I was not exactly starving, so I decided to give the wine a try, which was in goblets sitting in front of each chair. I took a small sip, and my mind took a kick in the pants. My vision became blurred with color, and I began to choke on my own tongue. The old woman told me that it stops hurting after the third glass and burst into sickening laughter. After about 5 minutes, the effects of the drink finally subsided, and I silently poured the rest onto the ground. I didn't think any one of them would notice. Suddenly, a bell rang out, and the diners stood up from their chairs in unison and approached the center of the clearing. Lombard made his way over as he walked me towards the center. "How did you enjoy the refreshments, the guests?" he asked. I held my tongue about the unpleasant experience at the table and said, "Everything was great. I've calmed down quite a bit now. What's next?" "Excellent, my friend. I'm sure we will patch things up with the girl after tonight, and I'm glad to have been of assistance to you. But now we have business to attend to." We found ourselves standing in the center of the circle of the hooded guests, all of them with hoods up and hands folded in front of them. Lombard instructed me to sit in the center of the ring. When I objected, he told me this was just a formality in order for the group to accept my presence amongst them for the night. I knelt as I was told, and Lombard took his place at the crimson altar. As I glanced around me, all of the robed people seemed to be emanating a strange droning sound that rose and fell as the minutes passed. I looked up at my mountainous guide, who had turned to face the center of the circle, and to my amazement had drawn back his hood to reveal a sight I would never forget. On Lombard's long, broad shoulders sat the head of a goat, jet black, save for the stripe of white between its pale green eyes and the spiraling, ivory-covered horns that curled backward behind his ears. The thing that stood in front of me lifted his hands into the air, and the droning immediately ceased. Lombard's head rolled backwards as he shouted into the night, "Ladies and gentlemen of the Black Circle, I present to you the Pale." The crowd roared with cheers and jubilation. "On this night we shall end the torment and bring about a new era of peace for our order." The younger man I sat next to earlier approached the orator. "My lordship," he whispered as he bowed on one knee, "I witnessed him earlier. He has not accepted the purifier. We cannot continue until he has." He then retreated back into his place and resumed the stance. "Is that so?" said Lombard quizzically. "Well then, I am sorry to delay, my children, but the sacrament must wait." The circle answered the statement with boos and howls of disapproval. A large member drew a curved blade from his robes and approached me. I attempted to stand, but was pulled down to my knees by an unseen force. "For the love of Sekra! I've waited my whole life for this moment," the man shouted as he flipped the knife into his hand. "Stop, you fool! You'll undo everything!" Lombard roared as he latched onto the man's arms. The last memory I have of that night was of the gargantuan, tree-like form of Lombard grappling with the hooded man until they both crashed to the ground in front of me. In the tangle of limbs, the handle of the man's knife struck me squarely between the eyes, and I lost consciousness. Part 2. I awoke in a small, sparsely furnished room with white walls and dark brown hardwood floor. Based on what I saw around me, I was able to estimate that the building was built in the late 19th century. I attempted to pull my head from the pillow, but was met with a crippling pain in my forehead where the knife handle had struck me at the ceremony in the woods. My legs were sore and felt as though they were filled with cement. It made me shiver that I could not figure out what prevented me from standing at the ceremony. Muffled speech resonated from outside my room as the door opened. A goat-headed Lombard strolled into the room and closed the door behind him. "Good morning, my guest," he bellowed. "I assumed you enjoyed your nap?" "Yeah, I did," I answered. "Right after that friend of yours almost broke my nose." "You needn't worry about him, my dear friend. His foolish actions have cost him his place in the order," he said with a reassuring tone. Lombard sat down on the bed next to me, and I instinctively wrenched my legs backward. "Calm thyself, friend. I am indeed human, and this is just a mask, nothing more." "What about everything else? The mumbo-jumbo you guys were talking about, the goat head, the black circle? I want answers now." "Oh, you have a right to be frightened. All will be explained to you. Let me start from the beginning." He readjusted himself on the bed to face me. "In the late 1800s, two cousins founded a town not far from here. It was a small farming community, very prosperous, a thriving community until the fever hit. Many died, including the mayor's daughter. In a last-ditch effort, the community banded together and stood united against the disease. They burned the village to the ground and moved into the mayor's farmhouse, the house you are now sitting in right now. The plan was a success. With all the medical personnel gathered in one area, it was much easier to treat the sick, and soon the fever was eradicated. Out of habit, the community stayed in this house as a single family to this day, of which I am the patriarch. The goat headdress symbolizes the single species of beast that provided us with food and drink during the dark times, and for your information, it is permanently adhered to my head. We dubbed ourselves the Black Circle in the name of the black table in the dining hall we would gather around to tell stories of hope to inspire one another. The event you were the center of was known as the Neophyte's Sacrament. We give the newcomer a small dose of a hallucinogenic and provoke you to reveal your true feelings to us in order to tell if we can trust you. I was strongly opposed to the sacrament, but I was pressured by the others and had no choice. The words we used were simply to disguise our discussion due to the circle's lack of trust. As for the actions of Alabaster, I sincerely apologize. Lombard pulled up his massive form and spoke directly to me. "Here I am, Valentine Ambrose Lombard II, with nothing to hide, at your service." Needless to say, I was awestruck at the volume of information that was imparted onto me. Before I could respond, Lombard asked, "Any questions?" I shook my head just as a woman, wearing simple brown robes, came into the room, dropped to one knee, and said flatly, "You are needed in the infirmary, my lord." Lombard turned to her and stated, "I will be there as soon as I can, Alice." Did Stefan have a run-in with the thresher again? "No," she laughed with a smile, eyes still trained on the floor. "Pierre was picking on Sylvia again. She snapped and let him have it with her little fists. I have them both down there waiting for you." The leader gave a hearty laugh. "That Pierre, almost as mischievous as I was when I was a little boy." He turned to me. "I will be back to speak with you later, friend. But now I must deal with this matter first. Get some rest." Both the leader and the woman walked out of the room and shut the door on their way out, leaving only silence in their wake. My head felt heavy, and I decided to take my new friend's advice and rest my eyes. I awoke in what looked like early morning to see Lombard sitting at the desk at the edge of my room. "Morning, friend," he said joyfully. "Come, sit. Have something to eat." He stood up from the chair to reveal a platter of sausage and bread with a glass of juice next to it. I was able to pull myself up from the bed. My legs were sore and my knees locked up, but I hobbled my way to the desk and sat down. And I began to sample the meal. "Gather your strength. You will need it for later. I've gotten it approved from the circle. I shall give you a tour of the house and the grounds around 3 today, so try and get those legs working by then." Lombard gave a quick wave of his hands as he left the room like wind blowing through the woods. I had finished my odd tasting dish after a few minutes. I sat for the remainder of the time stretching out my tired legs while looking out the window. The full day of bed rest and the struggle against whatever held me to the ground had left them aching and weakened. An expanse of farmland spread out in front of me, ending at a dense forest with a dirt road lined with torches leading up to the house. I assumed that somewhere in the woods there was the picnic table and the altar, and beyond that the cornfield I had met my guide in, and somewhere beyond that was Elizabeth. Home. I sighed. Ready? I jumped with surprise as Lombard broke the silence in the room. Time had passed faster than I had expected. Come, follow me, friend. I made uneasy strides out into a foyer with a painting of another goat-headed man and a massive chandelier lighting the room below and the rows of rooms lining the walls. Here is the second floor used for boarding for our members. The room you are staying in is the guest room. It is not used very often. It overlooks the entrance room, which we will visit later. Is that you in the painting? I asked. Ha! No, that is the founder of the circle, my great-grandfather, Ambrose Garrett Lombard. What a great man. I wish I could have known him in person. So he started the whole goat-head thing? I laughed rhetorically. We made our way downstairs and wandered through the entrance room and the living room and the sitting room. Listening to Lombard's tales of him reading stories to the children by the fireside in the winter, and of the old man who was a master of the old grand piano sitting in the living room. I asked him about the double doors at the end of the entrance, only to receive a response that I should not go in there as I do not have enough clearance to enter yet. We walked outside and we explored the grounds. From the outside, the house was massive. It was clearly some kind of old farmhouse. We made a left turn around the house to find 3 buildings off in the distance. I asked Lombard what they were for. He said one of them was the chapel, now dilapidated and unused, a small building used for a school, and a smaller concrete building used for storage. I shrugged plainly, and we moved on. I took that moment to ask, "Well, sir, what exactly is your job here?" Lombard stopped mid-walk to contemplate my question. I am the headmaster of the order, friend. I am many things. Judge, principal, father, doctor. Lots of things, friend. We walked back up to my room, and Lombard instructed me that now that I know where I am, I can move about the property at will, but only during the day. At night, I was confined to my room. Seeing as the sun was descending below the horizon, I went off to bed. I spent the next few days wandering the grounds while getting my bearings with the area and a sense of location. After speaking with some of the other followers of Lombard, I noticed a constant theme. They never broke eye contact, and they spoke in a very calm manner. Regardless of age, they would find a clever way to avoid any of my questions, specifically ones involving Lombard, the concrete building, or what happens in the Grand Hall. Seeing that I would never find anything out from the members, I decided to go answer hunting myself. Making my way out to the structure, which was about a football field's length from the house, I decided to carefully inspect it. The building had no windows and a single iron door with a large padlock on the front. I was going to investigate it further, but before I could find a way to open the lock, the sun began to set, and I reluctantly returned to the house. A couple of weeks of fruitless investigation passed until I was finally returned to my full healthy state. Feeling my strength returning, I began my morning with a quick workout. Lombard entered mid-push-up. "So, I see you are back on your feet again," he said dryly. "Yep, feeling pretty good," I returned. Lombard paced back and forth. "I imagine you will want to go home soon," he sighed. I stood up and looked at the tree-like figure. "Yeah, I suppose. I miss Elizabeth quite a bit, and I want to make amends." Good. Lombard paused. "Robert, if you could stay just one more week. We feel like you have become a member of the family around here, and we wish to perform a departure ritual this Sunday, just to say goodbye. You have been one of the kindest outsiders we have encountered in a long time." I walked up to the goat-headed giant, looked him in the eye like he had done so many times before, and smiled and said, "I would be honored, friend." That night, just before sundown, Lombard drifted once more in my room. He spoke in a much more serious tone than before, and his posture created an imposing aura about him. "Robert, we are having a ritual in preparation for your departure. I require that you do not disrupt it." Please stay in this room until my return. It is just a kind of rehearsal. I don't want to ruin any surprises." I quickly nodded in agreement, trying to ignore the sudden change in the headmaster's attitude as he sped out of the room. I had not been truly honest with my host during my stay in the house. For every act of hospitality he offered, there was an event or element that would cause a pang of distrust in my mind. One moment, Lombard would provide me with food, and I would see him teaching the children like a loving relative, but the next I would notice the concrete shack or remember what had happened in the woods weeks ago. The loving kindness of the members juxtaposed with their unnervingly smooth speech and piercing stare. Every impulse in my mind told me to run, but I knew I would never make it far before I was captured, or worse. This mysterious decree had brought my curiosity to its breaking point. That night I made a decision. As soon as the house fell silent, I removed my heavy work boots, slid the door open, and slowly stepped into the dark abyss. Since I had been climbing trees in my neighborhood park since childhood, the challenge of scaling the banquet hall's walls came easily to me. After making my way down the stairs, through the foyer, and out the door without so much as a sound, I was impressed with my sneaking abilities. I ran around to the side of the hall and began my ascension. The climb was easy enough. Several chunks were missing from the old bricks, creating excellent handholds. It wasn't long before I found myself on the roof. From the inside, I could hear the same droning sound that I had heard my night in the woods. I desperately searched for a way inside when I came upon a small hatch that led to a ladder that dropped off in a kind of storage attic. Hunkering in next to some old boxes, I was able to hear and see the events unfolding below me with startling clarity through a large crack. A crooked grin grew across my face as I anticipated the truth. The crowd of the hooded worshippers' drones hushed as the mammoth Lombard took the stage next to an eerily familiar altar. He raised his hands like the night we first met as he spoke with gusto. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Black Circle, I gather you once again to bring praise to Sekra and to celebrate the prescience of the Pale, whose life shall meet its beautiful end the evening of this coming Sunday." The crowd roared with approval. "My friends, I sincerely apologize for the," Lombard growled under his breath, "interruption. A few weeks ago." The audience erupted into a shower of boos and shouting. Now, my children, I have planned a rehearsal of sorts to show you all how we shall deal with the wretched Pale and drive this scourge from our beautiful order. I present to you the man who is to blame for the delay, Brother Alabaster." Each member howled with joy as they pulled a blindfolded man, naked, save for a loincloth with numerous strange tattoos adorned his chiseled torso, into the room and onto the altar. I felt my dinner rise in my throat. 3 men in red cloaks fastened the man's arms and legs to the altar as Lombard reached into a chest behind him. Alabaster was sobbing with fear, and his pleas for help became incoherent screams as his limbs were restrained, until one of the men in red wrapped a piece of cloth over his mouth to silence him. Lombard spun around at lightning speed and raised a shimmering dagger above his head. "Here and now, we give an offering to you, almighty Sekra, an offering of flesh and blood." Alabaster was writhing now, the altar glistening with sweat, and blood welling at the corners of his mouth as he struggled to cry out. The crowd lurched with anticipation, licking their lips with bloodlust in their eyes. "Now, for the glory of the Mother, he gives his life." Lombard pulled away the cloth, and Alabaster let out a scream so loud I could have heard it from my room. "Help him!" The gag was pulled back, and he was struck across the face. They pulled the cloth back again, and he cried, "For the glory of the Mother, I give my life." Without hesitation, Lombard drove the blade into the man's abdomen as he resumed screaming with pain and fear. The headmaster made a long cut up the stomach. I could hear bones cracking and flesh ripping as the man moaned in agony. Liquid scarlet spattered the headmaster's hands as it spouted from the gaping wound. Lombard tossed the bloody knife aside. He then plunged his hands into Alabaster's twitching body and wrenched his arms upwards several times until what appeared to be a liver was ripped away. I nearly vomited. Lombard held the dripping organ above his head and shouted, "For the glory of Sekra!" He plunged the hunk of flesh into his mouth like a wild beast. The crowd cheered with jubilation at the unholy sight. The corpse was unbound and drug off into a side room. I stared, unblinking, as my past feelings of my seemingly kind friend shattered. Before I could process what was going on, I heard Lombard address the members. "No one is to speak of this to our guest, and regarding the pail, I'm going to see how our friend is doing," he said with a chuckle. With my heart thundering, I bolted back to the roof as fast as lightning and hurled myself from the roof. Using my prior climbing skills, I tucked my legs in and rolled across the grass. I only sustained few minor bruises. I ran around the side of the house, up the stairs, and back into my room just as I heard the great hall open. I heard Lombard's thundering footsteps as he climbed the stair and approached the door. The door opened, and the giant eyes met mine. "Good to see your evening was a relaxing one, friend." I shrugged and said, "I've had better. Had a strange nightmare. Really messed with my head. How did your ritual go?" Playing dumb with him as best as I could. Lombard nodded. "All was well. The congregation is eagerly awaiting this Sunday's celebration. Enjoy your rest, friend." I could still see little bits of hastily wiped away gore clinging to his mask. Lombard shut the door as I heard the rest of the worshippers coming into the entrance hall. I sat and pondered my situation. I was trapped in this god-forsaken place for one more week until they have decided to kill me. 1 week to discover what was really going on here, and 7 short days to plan my escape. The next morning, I woke up early and ran off to the library, thinking that would be a good place to learn some information. The place had a wealth of books, everything from War and Peace to Pat the Bunny. I wandered the endless shelves until I reached the back corner of the room. All that sat on that last dusty old shelf was an old book with a leather cover. Nothing about it caught my eye, save for the title. The Book of Sekra. Remembering the mysterious name from the horror of last night, I snatched up the scripture and scurried out of the library unnoticed. I sat at the desk in my room and flung open the ancient volume. Before me sprawled mountains of text in Old English. Though it was in English, it was still difficult to understand as I trudged through chapters of sacrifice and lore. I found not much beyond useless gibberish about ceremonies, a few of which I recognized, the method in which one is seen to fasten a goat's head to their own, and a full-page print of a slender woman sitting on a throne with what looked like blood spattered around her mouth. Below it read, Sekra, Her Holiness. I returned the book to the library and made a decision to scour the grounds. Seeing as there was no way I could budge the padlock on the concrete shack, so I made my way to the chapel. The door slid open easy enough, and inside was what appeared to be a graveyard for old boxes and furniture. After searching for a few hours, I found nothing of interest amongst the stacks of rotting wood. The schoolhouse next door yielded similar results. A few desks sat in simple rows with a teacher's desk and a plaque bearing the name Master Lombard, and chalkboard at the front of the room. Nothing else. Feeling defeated, I emerged from the building when something caught my eye. In the grass at the door of the concrete building sat a shining padlock. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sprinted back toward the shack. I reached for the iron handle of the door when it suddenly sprang open. A short, stubby man emerged quickly, shutting the door. He noticed me and pushed his back against the door and spoke. "Oh, no, boy. Don't go in there. This place is not for the outsiders. Turn back around, boy. Go back to your room, lest I call for the headmaster." I sighed and grudgingly returned to the house. Though I was distraught over this defeat, I returned to my bed and met sleep with open arms. During the following days, I felt my sanity slipping away, and I slowly came to grips with my fate. I stayed in bed most of days, refusing to eat and trying to relive as many happy memories as I could before the inevitable bloodletting on Sunday. Several times during my stay, I had seen people running for the woods but they were almost immediately apprehended by groups of men clad in red cloaks. I feared the same thing would happen to me, and decided against making a run for it. Eventually, pulling myself up on Saturday night, I thought about my situation once more. Clasping my hands together, I contemplated how could I possibly survive. By the time I shut my eyes, I had summoned my last shreds of bravery and constructed a plan with a mental image of the house so I would know my best route out of this place. Shutting my plans away in my head and taking a deep breath, I surrendered myself to my subconscious. I rose late on Sunday afternoon, unfitting for one's final day on earth, but the inevitability of death weighed on me and kept me in bed. Lombard entered the room around 6 o'clock. "Are you ready to leave us, friend? We are making preparations for the ceremony now. When you are ready, please approach the painting at the other side of the second floor. Slide the painting to the right, and it should reveal a staircase. The staircase leads to my chambers. I need to perform the finishing touches for the farewell." I quietly nodded as the door closed. For a few moments, I sat and considered my plans. Sitting, sweating, and breathing heavily, I made my decision. I snatched one of the pencils from the desk drawer and slid it into my right boot. Following the giant's orders, I climbed the hidden staircase and entered a large circular room. The walls were lined with bookcases, with a massive desk resting in the center. On the desk sat piles of papers and a typewriter. Moonlight flooded in from a window above it all. Lombard greeted me with a hearty laugh. He told me to remove all of my clothing except for my pants. I obliged, and slowly inched toward him as I began unlacing my work boots. My left sock and boot sat on the floor next to me, and I began to work on my right. Glancing behind me, I saw Lombard looming in anticipation. I smirked and slowly slid the pencil from my boot. Without hesitation, I drove the pencil with all of my might into the Titan's stomach. Lombard buckled from the strike and dropped to his knees. I heard blood gargling in his throat. I snatched the typewriter from the desk, slid it across the desk as hard as I could, and smashed it across Lombard's face. The headmaster collapsed to the ground in a puddle of his own blood. Turning, I was about to make my way out of the room when I heard quiet laughter emanating from behind me. I spun around to see a bloodied Lombard rising from the carpet. His mask was now distorted and blood-soaked. "You, friend, are smarter than the average fool we drag off to this place," he croaked. I gritted my teeth. "I'm leaving this place. I know what happened a week ago. Now tell me what really goes on here." Lombard chuckled. "As you wish. What I told you about our history that morning was in fact true, though there were a few things I left out to keep you under my thumb. Those 2 cousins who founded the town are closer to us than you think. One of them was my great-grandfather, and the other was yours. Medicine was no longer working to drive away the blight, and my ancestor, the visionary that he was, decided to turn to other means of treatment. He found an old book amongst what he had found sightseeing in the old country. You seem to be familiar with it, which outlined how to give praise to an ancient goddess, Sekra. In exchange for a human life, Sekra would save another. We soon began driving her divine will to save the community. However, your great-grandfather, blinded to reality by his morals, left the village. Just before the birth of his child, he made a vow to Delius, the brother and polar opposite of the glorious Sekka, god of morality and justice, that his bloodline would be forever devoted to the eradication of the order. This whole ordeal has been our effort to destroy the one human that can destroy us and end the bloodline once and for all." I shook my head at all his story and asked, "So all of this was planned? How much of this is a plan? How long have you people been trying to do me in?" "I shall get to that in a moment, but here reveal a secret you will truly enjoy. Normally, one of your blood would cause a member in our order with an aura as dark as mine to drop dead with a single touch. I took this into account when dealing with you. I have been nullifying your power with the one thing that will weaken it: human flesh and blood." I went white at Lombard's statement. He began to laugh even harder. "That's right, friend. I have personally slipped a bit of human into each of your meals since you got here. You never even knew. Oh, your ancestors would be proud of you." Little did he know I hadn't eaten in days. I flung my hand out and grasped Lombard's wrist. Wrenching down, I felt a texture similar to squeezing down on raw meat. The giant roared as droplets of liquefied flesh dripped onto the floor. I apparently still had some power. He roared with pain and anger. I continued to twist and yank with my vice-like grip. I felt the crunching and oozing of now gelatinous bone pulling away from the muscle. Suddenly, I jerked with all my might and gripped onto Lombard's severed hand as the rest of him fell to the ground in a writhing heap. Lombard clutched his bloody stub. I see you wizened up to my trickery. Clever man you are. No matter, you will not leave this place alive. I will see to that. I shouted to him. You will never kill me, you monster. As soon as I escape, I'm taking Elizabeth and getting as far from town as we can. You will never be able to find us. Lombard began his hoarse laughter again. You will never be safe, friend. Even when you think you are the most protected, we will be there, watching you. We will never forget. Not even with that girl of yours are you safe. Wait till you hear that tale. Surely you noticed how your emotions distorted when you were close to her? You should know we took the liberty of turning her into a tool of sorts. We altered her mind to force you into awakening the ancient blood in your veins in order to drive you apart and into the arms of the circle. She was one of the most instrumental tools in our plot. She was such a naive girl. What a fool. Pretty, too. I lost it. I flung myself at my captor once again, and pressing my boot into his chest, I wrapped my hands around his horns and begun to pull. Lombard screamed with pain as I pulled at the mask. I felt each stitch pop as I wrenched upward. The Titan began to flail his hand and stub at my body, but every contact with my skin resulted in a feeling akin to the man punching a slab of molten metal. With one last ferocious pull, I felt the final stitch tear, and I flung the headdress against the wall, resulting in a splatter of blood and teeth. Lombard's body flailed, and I ran to the door. His disfigured face writhed as he cried into the air, I swear it, Robert Elm, you will never escape the hand of the Black Circle. You will die by my hand. I smirked at my handiwork. We will see, friend. I promptly sprinted down the staircase and out of the silent house. My legs ached from the flight with the giant, but I shrugged off the pain and ran across the grass as fast as I could. As I passed by the great hall, I could hear shrieks of terror and sorrow. I chuckled at the reaction to what I had caused. I'll never see that thing again, I muttered. I hurried myself to the concrete shack at the edge of the property. I figured now was a good enough time as any to see if I can get in that mysterious building. Halfway through the field, I turned to see hooded men with torches beginning their search for me. I quickened my pace. I was able to reach the unlocked door while the search party went off to investigate the barn and tool shed. Taking advantage of my moment of safety, I slowly slid the door open and saw a rather anticlimactic sight. The room was dimly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, several barrels around the corners and walls. A workbench was fastened to the wall next to another large metal door at the end of the room. Just as I got to investigating the room, I heard footsteps from behind the second door. My heart skipped a beat, and I had no choice but to conceal myself in one of the barrels. I slid back the lid and was met with a horrendous stench that caused me to gag uncontrollably. Reluctantly, I climbed into what felt like runny swamp sludge and held my breath. As soon as I did, the old man I saw earlier pushed the door open and hobbled into the room holding what looked like a corpse slung over his shoulder. He approached the workbench and flung the body onto the table. To my horror, he began meticulously working at the body with an assortment of knives, cutting and slicing with surgical precision. The entrance to the room opened again, and a group of hooded searchers entered and asked the old man if they had seen a man matching my description anywhere. He insisted that he had not, and after scanning the room for a few seconds, the men left as quickly as they came. I waited stiffly in the barrel, holding my breath as best as I could, taking in brief sips of air and staying as quiet as possible, as not to reveal my location. Suddenly, I heard the old man mutter to myself, "Oh yes, you will cook up nicely, won't you?" He let out a quiet chuckle. I gagged again, half with sickness and half with shock. I had caught the man's attention. Deciding it was time for me to make a move, I silently lifted the lid of the barrel and slid my soaked form onto the dark floor. Fear gripping tight, lid in hand, I raced toward the stunned butcher and struck him on the head with a hunk of wood. He dropped to the floor with a dull thud. I snatched the blade from his hand and made a dash for the door, but not before looking at myself under the dim light. My stomach turned as I saw my entire body soaked in a heavy coating of blood and chunks of meat. It drizzled and pooled on the floor. It sickened me. Holding back the urge to vomit, I nudged the door open, revealing a dark tunnel far more organic than anything I had seen in quite a while. All was silent except for the drips of blood from my skin and clothes. I quickened my pace as I heard shouting from far behind me. I held my breath, ignored my looming claustrophobia, and soldiered on through the darkness. The near-endless tunnel finally opened into a small candle-lit room. It was only about 12 feet across, with an arching ceiling. I had very little time to examine my surroundings, for when I entered the room, I saw a hooded worshipper with his back facing me, holding what appeared to be an old hunting rifle. Though at first my heart raced as I anticipated my own death, I was stunned to realize that he was unaware of my presence. Seizing the moment, I lashed out at the crown of his head with my stolen weapon. The man let out a quick yelp, fell to the ground, and lay motionless as blood pooled around his hood. I let the knife rest in his skull and snatched up the firearm. Here, something I can use, I mumbled to myself as I slung it over my shoulder. On the floor I noticed a small metal hatch. Seeing nowhere else to go, and remembering the search party on my tail, I opened it and descended the ladder that it opened to. The ladder met the ground in an alcove on the shore of a small pond. Near the ladder I found plastic tubs filled with things like shoes, backpacks, dog collars, amongst other things. Remembering the room with the old man and the cult's cannibalistic tendencies, the sight of all these tattered belongings was bittersweet. Grabbing one of the largest packs, I saw a pile of metallic objects out of the corner of my eyes. Bikes! Taking a deep sigh, I picked up the newest-looking one and rode off through the woods as fast as the wheels would spin into the night. After trudging onward through the woods for most of the night and subsisting off of some trail mix I found in the bag I took, I finally arrived in town. Needless to say, my friends and neighbors were amazed by my return. However, I knew I could not stay and chat. Walking up to my house, Elizabeth rushed out to meet me. I didn't even look at her. I continued inside, gathered my belongings, and climbed into my car with Elizabeth chasing me the whole way, asking me what was wrong, where had I been. I ignored her. She looked at me with the face of sorrow that I knew was just a mask, and when our eyes met, I could tell she knew the answers to her questions. I backed out of the drive and made my way for the highway. I never saw that town or Elizabeth again. Many years passed. I traveled town to town, but every time they found me. They always found me. For years I've been running from them, but I doubt I will ever escape their grasp. I have found safe haven in this place for 12 years, but I fear that they are now drawing near once again. I'm too old to run any more, my friend. Just too old now. The bartender stared in astonishment. So that is why you've been so solitary? Yes, I have fooled myself into thinking that the more I kept to myself, the safer I would be. And the bartender stuttered, and you're drinking. The sacrifice, the liver thing, is that why? The storyteller let out a hearty laugh. Yes. When they do find me and bite into my flesh, I want them to choke on it. The bartender laughed grimly, and the old man noticed that the moon was low. He stood and dusted off his pants. I best be leaving now. The sun will be here soon. It was relieving to finally share the story with someone. The bartender smiled. It was a joy hearing it. Have a good rest of the night, Mr. Elm. Robert nodded and started for the door. He took the subway home like he had every night, coming home from the bar, shaking his hands to keep the cold away. After a short ride, he made his way into his apartment building and climbed the stairs. He took a brief sigh and slowly opened his door. After hanging up his coat and scarf on the coat hanger and taking a seat in the armchair near the door, he looked off into the darkness, and something caught his eye. It was a gargantuan figure, with pale green eyes watching him from the shadow of the apartment. Slowly, the shape plodded forward to reveal a grotesque face with a wicked, mangled grin. Robert Elm sat motionless as he looked up at the being. The thing spoke to him in a devilish, yet labored groan. "Good evening, traveler."
A single lantern was the only source of light in the shop. 2 men stood in the center of the room, spilling out broadening shadows across the floor and against the counter and the empty walls. The shorter and heavier of the men, the bearer of the lantern, moved. Shadows swooped, and the floor creaked under his weight. He pushed a box into place, stepped on it, and reached up to hang the lantern from a hook descending from the ceiling. This done, he took a few steps to the counter. He blew a swirl of dust from the glass top and rubbed the surface clear with his handkerchief. "It's only dust, Mr. Bell. If you decide to take this place, we'll have it spotless before you move in." The taller man said nothing. With the light behind and above him only a slight distance over his head, his face was obscured and his expression could not be seen. The other man continued. "You won't find a better location in this town, Mr. Bell. You have 2 nice rooms upstairs for your living quarters and a large room in the back for storage or a workshop, and there's the big display window out on the street." "I'll take it, Mr. Lockyer." "A wise decision, Mr. Bell. There's no property in this town more suitable for a jeweler's shop." "I'm not a jeweler, Mr. Lockyer." Lockyer shook his head vigorously and waved his hand as if to brush away his error. No, of course not. You're a clockmaster. You mentioned that. Sorry, Mr. Bell. "I make and repair timepieces. I do not deal in trinkets." "Well, you're certainly needed here, Mr. Bell. You know, if anyone wants a clock or a watch repaired, he has to take it all the way down to Boston. That's a long trip, and more often than not, it's a waste of time." "I never waste time, Mr. Lockyer." "Oh, people are going to be mighty glad you came here. And you will be, too. You'll do well here, Mr. Bell. As a matter of fact, I have a watch you might look at when you're all set up. It was my grandfather's, originally. Kept perfect time for nearly a century, that watch did, but last year I dropped it on the stone floor down at the railroad station, and that was the end of it. I took it to the best jeweler in Boston, and those people held on to it for nearly 6 months, and then they told me they couldn't do a thing. It was beyond repair. Bring it to me." Do you think you might be able to replace the works?" "I'll repair it, Mr. Lockyer. Take it to your office tomorrow." "I will, Mr. Bell. I'll have the lease all ready for your signature. My men will get to work here first thing tomorrow morning. You'll be able to move in by the end of the week." "I'll do my own cleaning and move in tomorrow. Just give me the keys." Lockyer looked uncomfortable. "Well, now, it's always been our policy not to turn a place over to a tenant till it's spotless. I appreciate your hurry, but I just wouldn't feel right giving you a place in this condition. It needs a good cleaning." "I always do my own cleaning. Let me have the keys, and I'll be open for business tomorrow afternoon." "No, you'll never manage that, Mr. Bell. There's too much to be done." "I know how to make the best of time, Mr. Lockyer. Come by at 6 tomorrow, and your watch will be ready." Lockyer entered the shop a few minutes before 6 the following evening. He was astonished at the changes that had been wrought in a single day. The windows, the glass countertops, and the display case were all spotless. The floors and woodwork gleamed freshly polished. The shelves were filled with an assortment of clocks. Some were quite ordinary, others were like none that Lockyer had ever seen before. Bell was not in the shop. Lockyer went to the display case and stooped for a closer look at the clocks behind the glass front. The hours struck, and he was immersed in a medley of sound. Tiny chimes tinkled like tapped crystal. Deep tolling bells and reverberant mellow gongs vied with chirps and whistles and bird-song in a brief fantasia. Scores of figures came forth to mark the hour, each in its own way. Lockyer found himself drawn to the capering figures of a harlequin turning handsprings, one for each of the 6 peals of the little silver bell at the very top of the clock. The figure was smaller than his thumb, yet it moved with supple smoothness, free of the awkward lurching of the clock figures he'd seen so many times before. At the 6th stroke the harlequin turned its final handspring, bowed, and retreated inside a pair of gaily painted doors that shut firmly behind it. Lockyer leaned close, stooping, his hands on his knees, fascinated by the tiny figure's grace. He started at the sound of the clockmaker's voice, and straightened quickly to find Bell standing behind the display case. "I'm sorry I've startled you." I was watching. I was fascinated by this. I've never seen a clock like this, like any of these." You must come again when the hour is striking and see the others. Some are quite unusual.
Oh, they must be very expensive.
Oh, some are priceless. Others are less expensive than you might think. Lockyer leaned down to look more closely at the Harlequin clock. He touched his pudgy fingers to the glass of the case in a childlike gesture and drew them back quickly in the embarrassment.
How much is this one?
Oh, that one is not for sale, Mr. Lockyer. I've been offered a great deal of money for it, but I'm not prepared to let my little Harlequin go.
It's a marvelous piece of work. Everything in the shop is marvelous, and you've set it all up so quickly. It's incredible that you accomplished so much in less than a day.
Would you like your watch, Mr. Lockyer?
Oh, surely you haven't had enough time.
It will keep time for your grandchildren, Mr. Lockyer, and for their grandchildren, too.
Well, how did you do it? The watchmaker in Boston told me it was ruined. He said no one could fix it.
There are very few things that can't be fixed. Perhaps I've had more experience than others.
Oh, it looks brand new. I must admit I didn't think you could fix it.
It was a pleasure, Mr. Lockyer. The smaller man looked at his watch again, held it to his ear, and shook his head bemusedly. He tucked the watch into his vest pocket and reached for his wallet.
How much will it be?
Oh, there's no charge.
Well, you must have put a lot of time and work into this.
I never charge my first customer.
Oh, you're very generous. Well, you mentioned that some of your clocks are not too expensive, and perhaps, I'm sure my wife would be pleased with a nice clock for the mantel.
Then we shall find one to her liking. Bell walked slowly down the length of shelves, paused, retraced his steps, and at last stopped to take down a clock mounted atop a silver cylinder embellished with enamel swans on a woodland lake. He placed it on the countertop. The clock was silent. Its hands were fixed at a minute before 12. It's waiting for its proper owner. Bell touched something at the back, and the clock began to tick. When the hands met at 12, the cylinder opened, and to the accompaniment of a sweet melody, a little dark-haired ballerina stepped forth, bowed, and began to dance. Lockyer stared at the figure in astonishment.
Antoinette!
At the last stroke, the tiny dancer withdrew, and the cylinder closed around her. Lockyer continued to stare for a moment. Then he rubbed his eyes and looked up at Bell.
It's uncanny. We had a daughter. She loved to dance. We hoped that she'd be a ballerina, but it wasn't to be. She died of pneumonia 2 years ago.
I'm very sorry, Mr. Lockyer. I hope I have not caused you pain.
Oh, no, Mr. Bell. That little dancer is the image of Antoinette as she was when we lost her.
Then you have your daughter back. Every time the hour strikes, she will dance as she once did.
Oh, my wife would be so happy. She's never gotten over it, really. She seldom leaves the house any more. But that clock, I know it must be very expensive, but I'll manage to pay for it somehow.
Bell stated the price.
But that's ridiculous. You could sell this clock for 100 times that much.
I choose to sell it to you for exactly that price. No more and no less. Will you have it?
I will.
Then it's yours. The clockmaster made a quick adjustment at the back, turning the hands to the proper time. Then he took up the clock and handed it back to Lockyer. It's properly set now. It will require no further adjustment. I hope it brings pleasure to you and your wife.
Oh, it's certain to do that. Thank you, Mr. Bell.
Lockyer backed away from the counter, the clock cradled in his arms. The clockmaster's shop soon became a point of interest in the town. School children and idlers clustered outside the window to observe the hourly spectacle. Customers came in increasing numbers, some to bring a watch or a clock for repair or adjustment, and some to buy one of the timepieces that Bell sold at such modest prices. All who entered the shop stayed long, entranced by the marvels of workmanship that filled the display case and lined the shelves. Lockyer was a regular visitor. At least once each week, and usually more than that, he showed up at Bell's shop to report on the remarkable accuracy of his watch, to thank Bell for the ballerina clock, and then to examine the latest product of Bell's workshop. He was awed by the speed with which the clockmaker could create his marvelous mechanisms. Every week brought something new. Late in the year, when Lockyer stopped in the shop for a rainy afternoon, Bell was placing a new clock in the display case. At the sight of Lockyer, the clockmaker smiled and set the clock on the glass top, extending his hand in welcome. "Would you care to see it work?"
Yes, Mr. Bell."
Lockyer put his umbrella in the stand by the door and came to the display case. He saw a dark sphere about the size of a cannon ball. It appeared to be of crystal, so deep blue that it was almost black. Atop the opaque crystal was a small white and gold clock no bigger than a child's fist. The hands of the clock stood at 1 minute to 12. Lockyer studied the crystal and could distinguish nothing within but darkness. The clock was exquisite, the crystal flawless. But this seemed a disappointingly simple timepiece to come from one who was capable of the intricate and subtle mechanisms that filled the shop. It appeared Bell had read Lockyer's thoughts. "It's not quite so simple as it appears." Lockyer glanced sharply up in embarrassment. Bell smiled and set the clockwork going. By the time the hands had met, the darkness in the crystal had softened somewhat. At the first stroke of 12, a light appeared at the center. With each successive stroke, a new light glowed somewhere in the crystal, and all grew steadily brighter. The outer lights moved about the central one, brightest of them all. Smaller lights, hardly more than pinpoints against the rich blue that now suffused the sphere, circled some of the outer lights. Silent and serene, they moved in stately procession around the bright center. At the 9th revolution, the lights began to fade and the darkness deepen. When the 12th revolution was completed, only the faint glow at the center of the crystal remained, and then suddenly it was gone, and all within was darkness once again.
"Well, that's marvelous. It's the universe."
Only a representation of one small part.
"Well, it's incredible, Mr. Bell. Incredible. Those lights and the way they move. How did you do it?"
"I have my secrets. I thought you'd enjoy seeing this one, Mr. Lockyer. It will not be here after today."
"Are you actually selling it? Who could afford such a—"
Lockyer silenced himself abruptly, more embarrassed than before. Bell's dealings were no one's business but his own. If he undervalued his own work, the fact didn't seem to trouble him, nor did it do him any harm. "I charged a fair price, and the woman who ordered this very special clock for her husband can well afford it."
"Sutherland. It can only be Elizabeth Sutherland."
Bell nodded, but said nothing, and Lockyer went on.
"Well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it hurts me, Mr. Bell. It really hurts me to think of a beautiful piece of workmanship like this clock being in the hands of a man like Paul Sutherland. He doesn't deserve it."
"Mrs. Sutherland seems to think he does."
"Elizabeth has forgiven him 100 times, taken him back when he's done things."
Lockyer stopped himself. He gestured angrily and stood with reddened face glaring at that dark sphere. "Perhaps she loves him, Mr. Lockyer."
"Well, if she does, she's a fool. I'm not a prying man, but I can't help hearing things, and if only a fraction of the things I hear about Paul Sutherland and that crowd of his friends are true, well, Elizabeth should have left him long ago."
"Things may improve, Mr. Lockyer. People do change."
"Well, some people do. I know Sutherland, and I know he'll never change. Not if he lives to be 100.
"Well, we must hope." Lockyer nodded impatiently and went to the door. He took his umbrella, put his hand on the doorknob, and then turned to Bell.
"Look, Mr. Bell, I'm sorry. I had no right to say the things I said. I got angry for a moment. Elizabeth's an old friend. A lot of people in this town respect her."
"Oh, it's perfectly all right, Mr. Lockyer."
"No, it isn't all right. That's what troubles me. Sutherland is cruel to his wife and children. He treats his servants brutally. And to think of her giving him something so exquisite."
"As I said, we must hope. Perhaps this anniversary present will mark a turning point for the Sutherlands." Mrs. Sutherland arrived late that afternoon. She was a beautiful woman, her fine features almost untouched by time, her thick hair a glowing auburn. But years of unhappiness had left their mark in other ways. Her manner was cool and formal, and there was a tautness in her voice that served as a barrier to all but essential conversation. The sight of the clock changed her. She folded back her veil and looked with unfeigned delight at the motion of the tiny worlds within the sphere. When the last light faded, she turned eagerly to the clockmaker, her eyes aglow, her expression animated. "Mr. Bell, this is a wonder.
I've never seen anything to rival it. My husband will be overwhelmed." "I'm happy to see you so pleased, Mrs. Sutherland." "I'm delighted. Oh, it's quite beyond anything I expected, Mr. Bell." She placed her gloved hands on the crystal and looked into its dark depths, and as she looked her expression hardened, and weariness seemed to enfold her like a shadow. When she addressed him again, the barrier was in place. "If by any chance the clock should be damaged, Mr. Bell, we will, of course, take the greatest care of such a delicate mechanism, but children and servants can be clumsy. If some mischance should occur—" "I will repair it, Mrs. Sutherland." This town, like all towns, had its share of idlers and wastrels. Some of them were frequent observers of the noontime display in Bell's shop window, but being the sort of men to whom punctuality was not so much a virtue as an imposition, they didn't become patrons. Nearly a full year passed from his arrival before one of them visited the shop, and he came only to amuse himself at the clockmaker's expense. His name was Monson, and he was given to this kind of amusement. He was a portly, florid-faced man with handsome figures and a confident manner, well-dressed and well-spoken. He belonged to a prominent and prosperous family, though he himself showed no signs of industry or concern for good repute. He came to the shop one morning, spent a quarter-hour examining the clocks on display, and then introduced himself to Bell. "People say you repair damaged clocks and watches."
"I do."
"I heard you can repair any watch, no matter how badly it's been damaged."
"People have been satisfied by my work. Perhaps they exaggerate."
"Well, if you're as good as they say, I have a little job for you. It should be no trouble at all for a man of your abilities."
Monson drew a dirty rolled-up handkerchief from his pocket, laid it on the countertop, and unfolded it to reveal a jumble of wheels, springs, and tiny bits of metal. A cracked dial and a bent and battered watch case. All were encrusted with dried mud, and the case was scored and scratched.
Too much for you?
"Oh, perhaps not, Mr. Monson." Monson's smile wavered in the face of this calm response, but he quickly recovered.
"It slipped from my fingers and rolled into the roadway. A horse trotted into the dirt, and the wagon wheels rolled right over it. I thought it was beyond fixing, but this watch has sentimental value to me, and so I kept the pieces. And then when I heard everyone in the town singing your praises, I told them I'd bring the watch to you and let you show how good you really are."
His smile was a mocking challenge. "Come back tomorrow at 4.
"So soon, Mr. Bell? You work fast."
"I don't waste time, Mr. Monson, neither mine nor other people's." Monson left, and when he joined the friends who had waited for him outside, their laughter could be heard inside the shop. The next day all three came at the appointed hour. 3 other men, all well-dressed and in very high spirits, were also present, having entered only a few minutes earlier. They joined the others around Monson when he greeted the clockmaker and placed his palms on the top of the display case.
"My watch, if you please, Mr. Bell."
"Your watch, Mr. Monson." He placed a small box on the glass and opened it. Inside was a spotless white handkerchief, Monson's own, as the monogram attested, which he unfolded to reveal a watch in excellent condition. The hands were at 2 minutes past 4.
No, Mr. Bell, you must have misunderstood me. I want my own watch, not a replacement."
"This is your watch." Monson took up the watch and inspected it front and back. After a time he said,
"It may be my watch case, either the original or a damn clever imitation, but even if it is my own, the rest of it, I didn't authorize you to replace the works. I told you to repair them, and you said you would."
"I replaced only those parts that were missing. I repaired your watch, Mr. Monson."
"Nobody could have repaired that watch. I handed you a lot of junk."
"Oh, you did indeed. Nevertheless, I repaired the watch. Do you want it, Mr. Monson?"
"Well, of course I do. It's my watch, isn't it? You said so yourself. But if you think you're going to charge me some outrageous price, you'd better think again. I'm on to that trick."
Bell quoted the price of his repairs. The men with Monson grinned at one another. One of them laughed. Whether Monson or Bell or the situation in which they found themselves was the source of their amusement was not clear, but Monson didn't appear to share their feelings. He took the coins from his pocket and dropped them with a clatter on the glass top. He took up the watch, turned, and stalked from the shop without another word. Later that week, 2 of the men who had been with Monson came to Bell's shop. They looked over the clocks on display carefully and critically, and finally informed Bell that they intended to buy a clock for their club room at the hotel. Nothing on the shelves or in the display case was precisely what they had in mind, one of them explained further, but there were 3 that might be acceptable, providing the price was low enough. They pointed out the 3, and when Bell told them the price, they gasped at him in astonishment. "What do you mean asking prices like those? There's nobody in this town can pay that kind of money for a clock." "Yeah, I heard that if you like people, you sell them a clock for practically nothing. What's wrong with us that you ask so much? Do we look like fools?" "My prices vary. You saw how little I asked from your friend." "Well, then, treat us the same way if you don't want trouble." Bell did not reply at once. "You gentlemen have chosen 3 of the most expensive clocks in my shop. I have others that cost much less." "Well, if we wanted a cheap clock, we'd go to the general store. We're willing to pay good money for good workmanship, but we won't be gouged." "Well, perhaps I can show you something else. The clocks you selected are very delicate. I may have others more suitable for a gentleman's club-room." They blustered a bit, but were mollified by what they took as his apology. He went to his storeroom and brought out several sturdy clocks set in brass and polished mahogany with deep resounding bells to mark the hour. The price of these clocks was absurdly low. The men examined them and selected one, but even as Bell was packing it carefully in a box for them, one of the men looked longingly at the first clock they had chosen. "That clock with the little acrobat is still my favorite. Will you reconsider the price?" "I set my prices very carefully, gentlemen. It's impossible for me to bargain." "How does that acrobat work? That's what fascinates me. I didn't see any wires." "I didn't see any wires in any of them. Be damned if I can figure out how those little people operate. What's your secret, Bell?" Bell smiled, but said nothing. Probably just as well for us to get a good sturdy clock and not one of those others. They're interesting, but they wouldn't last long once things got boisterous down at the club. Even a good solid clock like this one may not last long. What do you say, Bell? If someone bounces this off a wall, will it keep on telling proper time? If anything happens to this clock, come to me. Elizabeth Sutherland revisited the clockmaker's shop in the spring. Bell was at the door awaiting her arrival, and she waved to him as her carriage pulled up. She entered the shop with the light step of a girl. Folding back her veil, she looked around the shelves and turned to Bell, beaming. "Mr. Bell, I came at a perfect time. You have a score of new creations on your shelves." "I trust the clock you purchased last year is performing satisfactorily?" "It hasn't lost a second, and it's such a pleasure to watch. It seems to be just a bit different every time it strikes. The children love it, and Mr. Sutherland is absolutely fascinated by it. He keeps saying that he intends to come here himself and tell you how much pleasure he's gotten from it." "I look forward to his visit, Mrs. Sutherland." "Well, I hope he gets to do it soon. He seems so very tired lately." "Yes, these are busy times. Please, Mrs. Sutherland, have a seat." "Oh, it isn't overwork. He just seems weary. It's almost as if he's gotten much older in the last few months." She was looking up at the shelves. Bell did not reply. He followed her gaze and then reached up to take the clock that had attracted her eye. She leaned closer, examined it, then looked at him and smiled expectantly. "It's a lovely scene, Mr. Bell. So peaceful. I can't imagine what I'll see when it strikes." The hand stood at 2 minutes to 3. The clock face was set in a gold dome that canopied a woodland scene, a still pond surrounded by willows. A rowboat about the size of a child's little finger floated near the center of the pond. In it was a figure in a straw hat, dangling a fishing pole in the water. All was serene. When the first chime struck, the fisherman pulled up a tiny fish, unhooked it, and cast his line again, to land a fish at each stroke. The 3 fish flopped and thrashed in the bottom of the boat. The fisherman took them up and dropped them back into the water. As the ripples spread and faded, he settled in his seat, tilted his hat against the declining sun, lowered his line, and returned to his fishing. Mrs. Sutherland clapped her hands together in an innocent gesture of sheer delight. "Oh, that's wonderful, Mr. Bell." "Thank you, Mrs. Sutherland. Is there any other you'd like to see?" "Oh, I love them all, Mr. Bell, but I'm really here to look for something suitable for my mother's birthday." Have you a special clock in mind? I was hoping you might have another clock like the one I bought for my husband. Oh, alas, no. Each clock is unique. But let me think. I may have something more suitable. He swept the shelves with a slow, searching gaze, and then studied the contents of the display case. He stood for a time, frowning, a finger pressed to his lips. Then, excusing himself, he withdrew to his workroom. Some minutes later he emerged, bearing a delicate white vase that contained 12 red rosebuds. "A clock, Mr. Bell?" He nodded, pointing to a small dial near the base, its hands at 1 minute to 12. He set the clock going and placed it before Mrs. Sutherland. As the clock struck, a rosebud opened at each stroke, and a growing fragrance filled the air. She exclaimed softly in wonder and delight, "Oh, Mr. Bell, it's absolutely perfect. My mother adores roses. I couldn't give her a nicer present." "I completed this clock only yesterday, Mrs. Sutherland." "Just in time for Mother's birthday." "Exactly on time, it appears." Late in the summer, Paul Sutherland died quietly at his home. He was in his early 40s and showed no evidence of disease, but in his last days he was a shrunken, white-haired man, drained and feeble in body and mind. His widow mourned him sincerely, but there were many in town who counted her fortunate to be free of him. In the fall, on a dark, rainy day of empty streets, Monson and 2 of his friends brought their damaged clock to Bell's shop. Monson stood it on top of the display case and stepped back laughing. The others joined in as Monson pointed to the shattered face. "One of the lads fancied himself a marksman, Bell. How long will it take for you to fix this one?" Bell took up the clock and examined it, turning it in his hands. His expression was grave. "Well, how long? We want it tomorrow. You're a fast worker, aren't you? Too much for you, Bell? If you can't fix it, we'll take another one to replace it. A fancy one of your special models this time." "Those clocks are not for sale." "You're a hell of a businessman, Bell. You don't want to sell your best goods, and what you do decide to sell, you sell at crazy prices. Yeah, he makes enough on the ones he sells to rich women. Is that it, Bell? Yeah, what are you up to with Liz Sutherland? She spends a good bit of time here, some people say. Don't get any ideas about her, Bell. You hear me?" "Leave my shop." "Leave? We're customers, Bell. You're a shopkeeper, and you'll treat us with respect. We want to look over these precious clocks of yours, all these not-for-sale treasures you're hoarding, and you will show us what we tell you to show us." "Leave my shop." Bell's voice was level and unchanged. He put down the ruined clock and took a step toward them. "How about this one?" Monson moved swiftly to the shelves and picked up a creation of gold and porcelain and brightly enameled metal on which a single uniformed guardsman stood smartly at attention. "Don't do anything to upset me now, Bell. I might drop it." Bell's voice was calm and icy cold. "Put down the clock and leave my shop." Monson looked at his 2 friends and grinned, and feigned dropping the clock, laughing loudly. At his motion the figure was jarred and fell to the floor. Monson quickly replaced the clock on the shelf. "I didn't mean to do that. You should have just kept quiet, Bell. We didn't intend any harm." "Of course you intended harm, and you've accomplished it." The atmosphere in the shop had changed in an instant. Bell seemed to loom over the 3 men, and they, though all of them were more powerfully built than he and some years younger, now shrank from him. He bent very gently, took up the fallen figure, and raised it close to his eyes. "You can fix it, Bell. Yeah, you can fix things like that easily. It's not as if we hurt anyone. Don't bother about the clock we brought in. It was a joke, just a joke." Monson stepped forward and thrust out his jaw defiantly. His voice was forced and unnaturally loud. "Just a minute now. Bell can fix that clock of ours, and there's no reason why he shouldn't. If I did any damage, any real damage, well, I'm willing to pay for it, as long as it's a fair price. We have nothing to apologize for. We'll pay, and that's the end of it." Bell raised his eyes from the broken figure in his hand. "I'll calculate the proper payment." The disappearance of Austin Monson and 2 of his cronies was a matter of general discussion and much speculation around town in the following months. Explanations of all sorts, from the ridiculous to the lurid, circulated for a day or 2, and then gave way to newer. But as time passed, interest waned, and soon the three vanished men were spoken of only by their friends. In the year that followed, Bell's clientele grew to include nearly everyone in town. Even the poorest family, it seemed, could afford to own a clock from his shop. And all of his clocks, whatever the price, however simple or elaborate, kept perfect time. No customer was ever dissatisfied. Bell was always available to a customer or a casual visitor, always willing to demonstrate some ingenious new timepiece. By this time, Lockyer and his wife had become regular weekly visitors, and every week Bell had a new clock to display, even more ingenious, sometimes close to magical. When the hour struck, one might see birds take wing, or porpoises leap from a miniature sea, or bats fly from a ruined belfry, woodsmen felled trees, skaters swooped and spun and cut intricate figures, a trainer put tiny lions and tigers through their paces, jugglers tossed Indian clubs smaller than a fingernail, a sailor danced a hornpipe, a dervish swirled in ecstasy, a stately couple waltzed serenely while a quintet of periwig musicians played, and never were the movements of these little figures awkward or mechanical, but always smooth and natural. No wires or levers or tracks could be seen, only graceful and disciplined motion, time after time. Bell seemed to sell his clocks as quickly as he could make them. Even those that were not for sale left the shop to be replaced on the shelves by new ones. Only a few were permanent. The little harlequin whose acrobats had captivated Lockyer on his first visit to the shop was still in place. The fire-breathing dragon on his hoard of gold and precious gems and skeletons in armor was still in a corner of the window, slouching forth every hour to the terror and delight of all the children. And a trim little pavilion of gold and porcelain and bright stripes of red and blue enameled metal, before which a uniformed guardsman marched and countermarched every hour, while a piper and a drummer marked the beat, stood where it had been for as long as Lockyer could recall, a year at the very least. During the holiday season, Bell's shop was a crowded, busy place, cheerful and lively. Those few townspeople who did not yet own one of his clocks were finally about to make a purchase, and others wished to buy one as a special gift for a relative or a friend. How he managed to do it, no one knew, but Bell met the increased demand and even produced a magnificent new clock, a lighted cathedral with carolers before its steps and a choir of angels hovering over its spires. He placed it in the window 3 days before Christmas, and every passer-by stopped to marvel. In the cold, dark days of the new year, the mood of the town changed. No one criticized Bell or his work or complained of his prices. But now the shop was often empty, no customers visiting for 2 or 3 days running. The Lockyers still came regularly, sometimes bringing their infant daughter. They noticed no change in Bell's manner and heard no word of complaint from him, but they sensed a difference that they could not explain to one another. New rumors had begun in the clubroom where Monson's friends still gathered. Here they drank and brooded, and their idle minds dwelt on the still unpleasant disappearance of their own companions. As rumors do, their stories fed on themselves, and interwove one with another, corroborating exaggeration with misstatement, and validating both with falsehood. In time they became firmly convinced of their own imaginings. Bell was the culprit, said the rumor-mongers. Why? Envy, of course. That was plain to anyone who knew the facts. Monson had shown him up, made him look foolish. The ridiculous clockmaker had thought himself a rival for the widow's affections. Fancy a woman like her wedded to a shopkeeper. And when he learned of her preference for Monson, jealousy added to envy had pushed him to desperation. Monson had put him in his place, and he sought revenge. It was obvious. Just what he had done to his rival, and how and why he had included others in his deed, was not clear. Bell was too crafty to leave evidence that would give him away. No one questioned his shrewdness, but he was the guilty party. That was plain to any reasonable person, and he must be brought to justice. At first the townspeople laughed at these wild tales, considering their sources and their probable motive. But they heard them again and again, and in time a tiny seed of something, not quite doubt, but perhaps a vague and reluctant uncertainty, took root in their minds. What was said so often, so earnestly, could not be completely without foundation, they told themselves. Not that they believed a word of it, but Bell was a mysterious man. No one would deny that. Where had he come from, and why had he come to this town? How could a man price his wares so erratically and stay in business, even prosper? Who bought those expensive clocks, and what became of the ones that were not for sale, but nevertheless vanished from the shelves? How could anyone produce mechanisms of such delicacy and precision so quickly and yet so perfectly, and still turn out sturdy, serviceable clocks at bargain prices? And if it was indeed true that Monson and his friends had been talking about visiting Bell on the very day of their disappearance, then the clockmaker owed the town an explanation. No amount of good workmanship, not even genius, exempted a man from the common judgment, said the good citizens. The rumors grew more insistent, the issues more troublesome, the questions more pointed as spring drew near. One evening, when the shop was closed and the streets empty, Lockyer tapped at the clockmaker's back door. Bell was in his workroom as he usually was in the evening hours, and he opened the door after a short delay. "Mr. Bell, you must seek protection." "I need no protection." "Oh, you do. You must know the stories that are going around town." "Well, I've heard foolish rumors." "Oh, you and I know that they're foolish, but others in town are beginning to believe them. There's talk of coming to your shop and demanding an account of Monson's disappearance." "My shop will be open at the usual hour. I've always been willing to answer reasonable questions. Will you come in, Mr. Lockyer?" No, I can't. But you must do something to protect yourself. Monson's friends are behind this, and they want to hurt you. They may break in on you in the night." "Will the townspeople permit this?" "Well, no one wants anything to happen to you, but Monson's friends have everyone confused. They have a lot of influence in this town. Well, some of them do anyway, and the people have heard so many stories they don't know what to believe. They're confused." "So I must fear the actions of a lawless mob?" "I'm afraid that's the case. You must protect yourself." "I will, Mr. Lockyer." Without another word, Bell closed the door. Lockyer heard the bolt slide into place. They came to the shop later that night, 11 men strong. Others waited outside, at front and back. Several had been customers at one time or another, and some had come on occasion to observe the clocks as they struck the hour or watch the display in the window. 3 who had been present when Bell had presented Monson with his repaired watch were the leaders. The others did not speak. "We're here to find out what you did to our friends, Bell. We're not leaving till we're satisfied." "Why do you blame me?" "They said they were coming here. We all heard them say that, and then we never saw them again. You're the one behind their disappearance, all right. So just admit it, Bell. We can make you tell us everything if you force us to." One of the others raised a walking stick and tapped it on the glass top of the display case. "We can smash this place to bits, and you with it. Now tell us what you did to our friends." Bell looked down at him, then at the man with the walking stick, then at such others as met his glance. He raised his hand and pointed to the door. "It's best that you leave my shop. Best for you, that's certain, but we're not leaving." Several of the others, under the challenge of his ferocious gaze, murmured their agreement. "Don't try to bluff us, Bell. You've bluffed this whole town for too long. Answer our question or it's going to get mighty Answer our questions or it's going to get mighty unpleasant." He brought his stick down sharply. The glass cracked. Then, suddenly, at exactly 9 minutes past the hour of 1, all the clocks in the shop began to strike in unison. Deep gongs and crystalline chimes, resonant bells, and the sound of tiny drums and trumpets, and a din of indistinguishable pealings and tolling and clanging, all blended to engulf the intruders in a wave of sound. And on they struck, 12 times and 12 more, and 12 times 12 more, rapidly at first, and then steadily diminishing in volume and rapidity, fading as if they were receding at a steady rate, becoming even fainter until they could be heard no more. The men stood, benumbed by the assault of sound. They felt no pain and sensed no restraint by external force. Not one of them carried any trace of physical harm as a result of that night. Their breath came freely, they could move their eyes and hear every sound. But their bodies were held as if the air had grown viscid and glutinous, clinging to them, dragging at them like thick mud or heavy snow, but 1,000 times more inhibitive than mud or snow, because, invisible and insensible as it was, it clung not only to their feet and legs, but to their hands, arms, heads, and bodies. They felt as if time itself had crawled almost to a halt, congealing and trapping them within it like insects in amber. Those who spoke of that night, and few of them ever did so, and those few reluctantly after long silence and still fearful of ridicule, agreed on several points. Bell, they all said, was untouched by the phenomenon. He removed the clocks from the shelves and the window and the display case one by one, carefully and lovingly, and took them into his workroom. This process took some time, several hours at least, but none of the men felt the pain or cramping that such a long period of enforced immobility or near immobility would be certain to cause. Bell worked methodically, ignoring the intruders, his attention confined to his clocks. On these facts all agreed, but each had his own particular memory of that night. According to one man, the shop grew steadily darker. Another said that the light remained constant, but Bell himself moved ever more swiftly, until at last he moved too fast for the eye to follow and vanished from sight. A third man claimed that Bell grew more insubstantial and wraith-like with each timepiece he removed, and at last simply faded into nothingness. One man recalled a sight of a fly that passed before his face so slowly that he could count the beats of its wings. The fly progressed no more than a foot, and yet the man swore that its passage consumed 3 hours at the very least. One of his companions spoke of the disturbing sight of ash fallen from the cigar in the hand of a man standing near him. It fell to the ground so slowly that in all the time he stood confined, no less than 4 hours by his calculation, it had not reached the floor. 2 other men mentioned their awareness of each tick of a clock, separated by an agonizing interval. One claimed a full hour's space, while the other spoke only of a horrible long wait between one tick and the next. Whatever happened on that night, however it happened, when the men could move, and their immobility ended in an instant, without warning, Bell and all the clocks were gone. 5 men fled the shop in terror the instant they had commanded their legs. Those who remained did so more from fear of showing fear than from courage or even anger. They looked to one another uncertainly, awaiting direction, and finally someone said, "We have to go after him." The workroom was dark and empty. They drew the bolt on the back door, and one shouted to the other waiting outside, "Did you see him?" A man carrying a pick-handle emerged from the shadows. "Didn't see nobody. Nobody's come out that back door." "Are you sure?" "Well, of course we're sure. Damn it! What happened? Bell get away from you?" They didn't reply. They returned to the shop, and noticed something that had escaped them in the first shock of freedom. The shop was thick in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling and rounded the upper corners of the shelves. The air was stale like that of a room long sealed. As they looked around them, the clock in the town hall struck the quarter hour. One man looked at his watch and announced in a hushed voice, 1:15. No one ever learned what became of the clockmaker. No clocks like his were ever seen again by any of the townspeople, even those who traveled widely and took an interest in such things. Those that he sold have been passed on through 3 or 4 or even 5 generations. They keep perfect time and have never required repair.
Chilling tales for dark nights.